Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Nightmare Narratives. I can picture some of you already in bed, maybe some of you just getting home from work. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I'm glad you're here. If this helps you relax or sleep, please like and subscribe. It means a lot. Now let's get you comfortable, and I'll tell you tonight's story. My name is Dorothy Fieldstone, and I've spent 13 years studying birds in these West Virginia mountains. People always ask me why I left my comfortable teaching job in Pittsburgh to live alone in a ranger station, watching birds all day. The truth is, after my husband died, the silence of the forest felt more honest than the noise of the city. I have a PhD in ornithology, that's the fancy word for bird science. I know over 400 bird calls by heart. I can tell you the exact day when the warblers will start their spring migration, or when the last hawk will head south for winter. I've banded thousands of birds, written papers about their habits, and given talks at universities. Birds make sense to me. They follow patterns. They're predictable. That's why what happened in November 1967 scared me so much. I work in the Monongahela National Forest, right near the border with Point Pleasant. My station covers the old TNT area. TNT, those concrete bunkers left over from World War II, where they used to store explosives. Most folks avoid that place. The soil is still poisoned from all those chemicals, and nothing grows right there anymore. The trees look sick, twisted. Even in summer, the grass stays yellow, but it's perfect for bird watching. The chemicals keep most people away, which means the birds aren't disturbed. I've documented species there that haven't been seen in other parts of West Virginia for decades. November is my busy season. That's when the last birds head south before winter hits. I spend most of my time in the TNT area during migration, counting birds, checking their health, recording their patterns. The forest gets quiet this time of year. Just me, my binoculars, and my notebook. I never believed the stories about monsters. Growing up in these mountains, you hear all kinds of tales. Bigfoot sightings, ghost lights, creatures in the woods. Mountain folk love their scary stories. I always figured they were just entertainment, something to tell around campfires. Even when people started talking about the Mothman around Point Pleasant, I didn't pay attention. Some folks claimed they saw a giant bird thing with glowing red eyes. Said it was as tall as a man, with wings bigger than any airplane. The local newspaper ate it up, printing every crazy story they could find. Mass hysteria, I told Sheriff Johnson when he stopped by my station one afternoon. People see what they want to see. Probably just a big owl, or maybe a crane blown off course. Sheriff Johnson was a practical man, not given to flights of fancy. He'd been keeping the peace in Mason County for 20 years. But even he looked worried that day. "Dorothy, I've had 12 separate reports this month," he said, sipping the coffee I'd made. "These aren't kids playing pranks or old-timers telling tales. I'm talking about solid citizens. A bank manager, 2 teachers, even Reverend Patterson from the Methodist Church." I shrugged. People love a good scare, especially around Halloween. You know how it is. "Maybe," he said, but he didn't sound convinced. "Just be careful out there, all right? Especially in that TNT area. Something's got the animals spooked." I should have listened to him. It started with the birds dying. On November 15th, I was making my usual morning rounds when I found them. At first, I thought I was looking at some kind of art installation. 23 birds, mostly crows and ravens, arranged in a perfect circle in the clearing near bunker number 7. They weren't scattered around like birds that had died naturally. They were positioned exactly, heads pointing toward the center of the circle, wings spread out like they were still flying. I'd never seen anything like it in 13 years of field work. I knelt down to examine the first crow. No obvious injuries, no signs of disease. Its eyes were clear, not cloudy like you'd expect from a bird that had been dead for a birder. While I checked its feathers, looking for mites or damage. Nothing. The bird looked perfect, like it had just dropped out of the sky. But here's what really bothered me. There were no scavengers. In a healthy forest, dead animals don't last long. Ants, beetles, flies. Something should have been working on these carcasses. Instead, there was nothing. Even the flies seemed to be avoiding the circle. I spent the rest of the morning collecting specimens, taking photographs, making notes. This was the kind of thing that could make a career. a mass bird death with no obvious cause. I was already planning the paper I'd write, imagining the headlines in the ornithology journals. I loaded the bird bodies into my truck and drove back to my station to start the real work. I had a small lab set up in the back room, microscope, basic chemistry equipment, freezer for storing specimens. If these birds had died from some kind of poison or disease, I'd find it. But when I tried to develop the photographs I'd taken, the film came out completely black, every single frame. I'd been using that camera for years without problems. I checked the settings, examined the film canister. Everything looked normal. I tried again with a different camera. Same result. Black film. That night, I sat in my kitchen, staring at the bird specimens lined up on my counter. In the harsh fluorescent light, their feathers had an odd shine to them, almost metallic. I'd never noticed that in the field. I picked up one of the crows and examined it under my desk lamp. The feathers definitely had a strange quality. They seemed to shift color as I moved them, like oil on water. But when I looked closer, trying to see exactly what was causing the effect, it disappeared. The feathers looked normal again. I was tired. It had been a long day, and I was probably imagining things. But as I got ready for bed, I found myself checking the locks on my doors twice. I'd never done that before in all my years at the station. The next morning, I was back at the TNT area before sunrise. I wanted to examine the death site again, take measurements, look for clues I might have missed. The November air was sharp and cold, and my breath made little clouds as I walked through the bunkers. The circle where I'd found the birds was empty now, but the grass inside it looked different. Burned, almost. Not like fire damage, more like the grass had just given up. It was brown and brittle, though the grass around the circle edge was still green. I was taking soil samples when I heard it, a sound like nothing I'd ever heard before. Not a bird call. I knew every bird call in these mountains. This was deeper, more like a hum mixed with a whistle. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing off the concrete bunkers. I stood up, looking around. The forest had gone completely silent. No wind in the trees, no small animals rustling in the underbrush. Even the insects had stopped their usual background noise. The sound came again, longer this time. It made my teeth ache. "Hello?" I called out. Maybe it was another researcher, someone with equipment I wasn't familiar with. "Is someone there?" No answer. But I had the strongest feeling that something was watching me. I finished my soil collection quickly and headed back to my truck. As I was loading my equipment, I noticed something that made my hands shake. Tracks in the mud near bunker number 12. At first glance, they looked like bird tracks, 3 long toes pointing forward, 1 pointing back. But they were massive. Each print was nearly 10 inches long, pressed deep into the wet earth, like whatever made them was incredibly heavy. No bird that size existed. Not in North America. Not anywhere. I knelt down to examine the tracks more closely. The depth suggested something much heavier than any bird could be. And the spacing between the prints was wrong too. Too far apart for a colentine, bird's walking pattern, but too close together for the long hops of a crane or heron. I tried to take pictures, but again, the film came out black. I made detailed sketches in my notebook instead, measuring each track carefully. Whatever had made these prints had been here recently. The edges were still sharp, not softened by rain or wind. Back at my station, I spread every bird identification guide I owned across my desk. North American birds, exotic species, extinct varieties, I looked through them all. Nothing matched those tracks. The closest I could find were crane prints, but even the largest sandhill crane tracks were less than half that size. I called the university, spoke to my old professor, Dr. Harrison. He'd been studying birds for 40 years, traveled all over the world documenting species. 10-inch bird tracks? His voice sounded puzzled over the crackling phone line. "Dorothy, are you sure they weren't made by something else? Maybe a dog with an unusual gait, or someone playing a prank with fake prints?" "I know what I saw, Professor. These were definitely bird tracks, just impossibly large." There was a long pause. "Well, send me your sketches. I'll ask around, see if anyone's heard of anything similar. But Dorothy, be careful out there. Some of my colleagues have been hearing strange reports from all over Appalachia. Animals behaving oddly, unusual migration patterns. Something's got the wildlife spooked." That afternoon, I decided to set up motion-activated cameras around the TNT area. If something was making those tracks, I wanted proof. Real, undeniable evidence. I placed 3 cameras at different locations, one near the death circle, one by the large tracks, and one on top of bunker number 7, which gave a good view of the main clearing. As the sun started to set, I packed up my gear and headed back to my truck. The forest felt different in the evening light. Darker somehow, even though there was still plenty of daylight left. The shadows between the bunkers seemed deeper than they should be. I was loading the last of my equipment when I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. Something large had landed on top of bunker number 12. At first, I thought it might be a turkey buzzard. They were common in the area. But as I turned to look directly at it, my blood went cold. It was definitely bird-like, but wrong in every possible way. Too big for one thing. Even crouched down, it was taller than a man. Its wings were folded against its body, but I could see they were massive, easily 10 feet across, maybe more. But the worst part was its eyes. 2 red lights glowing in the gathering dusk, bright as car headlights. They weren't reflecting light like normal animal eyes do at night. These were producing their own light, pulsing slightly like a slow heartbeat. The thing was staring directly at me. I couldn't move. Every instinct told me to run, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. We stared at each other across the clearing, and I felt something pushing at the edges of my mind. Not words exactly, but images, feelings, danger, warning, something terrible coming. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature spread its wings and took off. The sound was like thunder, like a freight train, like nothing natural. It rose straight up into the darkening sky and disappeared. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, shaking, before I could trust my legs to carry me to the truck. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. All the way back to my station, I kept checking my rearview mirror, expecting to see those red eyes following me. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago, trying to write down what I'd seen. Every time I tried to describe it, the words seemed inadequate. How do you explain something that shouldn't exist? I thought about calling Sheriff Johnson, but what would I tell him? That I'd seen the exact creature he'd been getting reports about? The one I'd dismissed as mass hysteria just days before? Instead, I pulled out my bird books again and started reading about the largest flying birds in the world. Andean condors with 9-foot wingspans, prehistoric teratorns that had been extinct for thousands of years. Nothing came close to what I'd seen. But deep down, I knew I wasn't dealing with any normal bird. What I'd seen in that clearing was something else entirely. Something that shouldn't exist but did. And it had been watching me. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound outside made me jump. The wind in the trees, a branch scraping against the roof, my old truck settling in the cold. Around 3 in the morning, I gave up trying and made another pot of coffee. When dawn finally came, I was already dressed and ready to check my cameras. Part of me hoped they'd show nothing, that I'd imagined the whole thing. But a bigger part needed to know the truth. The drive back to the TNT area felt different in daylight. The bunkers looked normal again, just old concrete buildings left over from the war. Hard to believe I'd been so scared just hours before. The first camera, near the death circle, was gone. Not damaged, not knocked over. Gone. I found the metal mounting bracket still screwed to the tree, but the camera itself had vanished completely. No tracks around the tree, no broken pieces, nothing. The second camera was still there, but when I popped out the film canister, I knew before I even looked that it would be black, just like all my other photos from this place. The third camera, the one on top of Bunker 7, had been turned around. Instead of pointing at the clearing like I'd set it up, it was now facing directly back toward where I was standing. Like something had deliberately repositioned it to watch me instead of the area. My hands were shaking as I climbed up to retrieve it. The camera itself looked normal, but there were scratches in the concrete around it. Long gouges, like claw marks. Each one was nearly an inch deep. I was examining the scratches when I heard voices. "Dorothy, you up there?" Sheriff Johnson's voice echoed off the bunkers. I looked down to see him walking across the clearing with 2 other men I didn't recognize. Government types, by the look of their dark suits and serious faces. "Coming down," I called, grateful not to be alone anymore. When I reached the ground, Sheriff Johnson made quick introductions. Dorothy Fieldstone. This is Agent Morrison and Agent Webb from the state police. They're here about those reports we've been getting. Agent Morrison was a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and the pale complexion of someone who spent most of his time indoors. Agent Webb was bigger, broader, with the kind of suspicious eyes that seemed to catalog everything around him. Miss Fieldstone, Morrison said, we understand you've been conducting research in this area. Have you noticed anything unusual in the past few days? I hesitated. These men looked official, but something about them bothered me. Maybe it was the way Webb kept glancing at the bunkers, like he knew more about this place than he was letting on. Unusual how? I asked. Animal behavior, environmental anomalies, anything that might explain the reports Sheriff Johnson has been receiving. I told them about finding the dead birds, about the strange tracks. I didn't mention seeing the creature itself. Something told me to keep that to myself for now. Morrison took notes while I talked, but Webb just watched me with those cold eyes. When I finished, Morrison closed his notebook with a snap. Miss Fieldstone, I'm going to ask you to stay away from this area for a while. We're conducting our own investigation, and civilian presence could compromise our work. What kind of investigation? I asked. This is a national forest. I have every right to. Not this section, Webb spoke for the first time. His voice was flat, emotionless. As of this morning, the TNT area has been classified as a restricted zone. Environmental contamination concerns. Sheriff Johnson looked as surprised as I felt. Nobody told me about any restrictions. Webb handed him a folded paper. Your authorization to enforce the new boundaries. No one goes in or out without federal clearance. I wanted to argue, but something in Webb's manner told me it wouldn't do any good. These men weren't here to investigate the Mothman sightings. They were here to cover them up. I'll need to collect my equipment, I said. I left some instruments in the area yesterday. Morrison nodded. Agent Webb will escort you. 30 minutes, then the area is off limits. The walk back to my research sites was tense. Webb stayed close behind me, not talking, just watching. When we reached the spot where I'd found the dead birds, I stopped short. There were more of them, at least 50 birds this time, arranged in the same perfect circle pattern. But these weren't just crows and ravens. I saw cardinals, blue jays, even a red-tailed hawk. All different species that would normally never flock together, all dead, all positioned with impossible precision. Don't touch anything, Webb said sharply when I started toward the circle. I'm a researcher. This is important scientific data. Not anymore, it isn't. He was already speaking into a radio. Base, this is Webb. We need a cleanup crew at Site 7 immediately. I stared at him. Cleanup crew? You're going to destroy evidence of a mass die-off? This could be the key to understanding what's happening here. Webb's expression didn't change. Miss Fieldstone, you have 20 minutes to collect your personal equipment. I suggest you use them. I gathered my instruments quickly, anger and frustration making my movements sharp and jerky. Whatever was happening here, these men knew more about it than they were saying, and they had no intention of letting me continue my research. As we walked back toward the parking area, I heard it again. That impossible sound, half hum, half whistle, seeming to come from everywhere at once. Webb stopped dead in his tracks. For the first time since I'd met him, he looked genuinely frightened. What was that? I asked. He didn't answer, but I saw his hand move toward the gun under his jacket. His radio crackled to life. Webb, get out of there now. We're reading massive electromagnetic disturbance in your area. The sound came again, louder this time. The trees around us started to sway, even though there was no wind. My compass spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. That's when I saw it. The creature was perched on top of Bunker 12 again, but this time it wasn't hiding. Its wings were fully spread, blocking out half the sky. Those red eyes blazed like furnaces, and when it looked at me, I felt that presence in my mind again. But this time, the images were clearer, more urgent. I saw the silver bridge that connected Point Pleasant to Ohio. I saw cars crossing it, people going about their normal lives. And then I saw it falling, collapsing into the dark water below, taking dozens of people with it. The vision was so real, so immediate, that I cried out. Webb grabbed my arm, dragging me toward his car. "We're leaving, now." But I couldn't stop watching the creature. It was trying to tell me something, trying to warn me. The bridge would fall. Soon. And people would die unless someone listened. Webb shoved me into his car and gunned the engine. As we sped away from the TNT area, I looked back to see the creature take flight. It rose into the gray November sky like a dark angel, circling once before disappearing toward Point Pleasant, toward the bridge. That night, I sat in my kitchen, trying to make sense of what I'd experienced. The vision had felt completely real, more real than my normal memories. I could still see the bridge collapsing, could still feel the terror of the people trapped in their cars as they plunged into the cold water. I thought about calling someone, warning them, but who would believe me? And what would I say? That a giant bird creature had shown me a psychic vision of disaster? I was still wrestling with the decision when my radio crackled to life. Emergency services frequency, which I monitored as part of my job. All units. We have reports of structural stress on the Silver Bridge. Engineering team requested for immediate inspection. My blood went cold. It was starting. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my truck keys and headed for Point Pleasant as fast as I could drive. The vision had been so clear, so urgent, I had to at least try to warn someone. The Silver Bridge connected Point Pleasant to Gallipolis, Ohio, across the Ohio River. It was built in the 1922, an elegant suspension bridge that thousands of people crossed every day. At rush hour, traffic would be heavy. If the bridge collapsed with cars on it, I tried not to think about how many people could die. I reached Point Pleasant just as the evening rush was starting. Cars were lined up to cross the bridge, people heading home from work. Everything looked normal, peaceful even. For a moment, I wondered if I was losing my mind. Then I saw the Mothman. It was perched on one of the bridge's towers, its massive wings wrapped around the steel structure like a dark embrace. Those red eyes were blazing brighter than ever, and even from a distance, I could feel its urgency, its desperate need to communicate. I parked my truck and ran toward the bridge approach. A few other people had noticed the creature now. They were pointing, shouting, some taking pictures. But no one seemed to understand what it meant. "Get away from the bridge," I yelled, waving my arms. "Everyone get back." People looked at me like I was crazy. A police officer approached, probably thinking I was having some kind of breakdown. "Ma'am, you need to calm down. What's the problem here?" "The bridge is going to collapse," I said, grabbing his arm. "That thing up there, it's trying to warn us. We need to stop traffic, clear the area." The officer looked up at the Mothman, then back at me. "Ma'am, that's just a large bird, maybe a crane or something. There's no reason to." That's when the cables started to sing. It was a high, thin sound, like violin strings being pulled too tight. The Mothman spread its wings wider, and the sound got louder. Metal groaned, concrete cracked. The police officer's radio crackled. "Bridge control to all units. We're reading critical stress levels on the main suspension cables. Recommend immediate closure to traffic." Too late. With a sound like the world breaking apart, the Silver Bridge began to fall. I watched in horror as the roadway buckled and twisted. Cars slid sideways as the pavement tilted at impossible angles. The Mothman launched itself from the tower, circling overhead as people screamed and ran. But here's what I'll never forget. In those final moments, as the bridge was coming apart, I felt the creature's presence in my mind again. Not showing me disaster this time, but something else. Coordinates. Locations along the river where people were in the water, where rescue teams should look first. The Mothman wasn't just a harbinger of doom. It was trying to help save lives. I ran to the rescue command post that was setting up near the water. The Coast Guard was already launching boats, but they were searching randomly, covering as much area as they could. "The survivors are downstream," I shouted to the nearest officer. "About 300 yards south of the bridge, near that cluster of trees hanging over the water." "Ma'am, how could you possibly know that?" I couldn't explain, but I knew, with absolute certainty, that there were people in the water at that exact location. The Mothman had shown me. "Just trust me, please." The officer looked at me for a long moment, then spoke into his radio. "Unit 7, concentrate your search near the Willow Grove, 300 yards downstream from the bridge site." 20 minutes later, they pulled 4 survivors from the water at that exact location. Over the next several hours, as rescue operations continued, I found myself relaying information I shouldn't have known. Where to find more survivors, which areas were too dangerous for divers, where pieces of the bridge had created underwater hazards. Every piece of information came from the same source, brief, intense moments when I felt the Mothman's consciousness touching mine. It was still out there, circling the disaster site, somehow seeing everything at once. By dawn, 37 people were confirmed dead, but dozens more had been saved. The rescue coordinator told reporters it was a miracle so many had survived such a catastrophic collapse. I knew the truth. The miracle was a creature that shouldn't exist, trying desperately to save human lives. As the sun came up over the Ohio River, I saw the Mothman one last time. It was perched on a hill overlooking the wreckage of the bridge, motionless as a statue. For just a moment, those red eyes met mine across the distance. I felt a final image form in my mind. Not a vision of disaster this time, but something else. Acceptance, maybe. Sadness. And underneath it all, a sense of duty that would never end. Then, it spread its wings and disappeared into the morning sky. Agent Webb found me an hour later, sitting on the riverbank, watching the rescue boats. "Miss Fieldstone," he said, settling down beside me on the cold ground. "We need to talk." "About what?" I was exhausted, emotionally drained. I didn't have the energy to be afraid of him anymore. "About what you saw, what you experienced." His voice was gentler now, less official. "You're not the first, you know. We've been tracking similar encounters for decades, people who've had contact with entities, like the one you've been seeing." I looked at him sharply. "You know what it is? We have theories. Ancient protectors, maybe. Beings that exist at the intersection between our world and something else. They appear before disasters, try to warn people. Most of the time, no one listens. But this time was different." Webb nodded. "This time, someone could interpret the warnings. Someone who understood." I thought about the past few days, about all the strange experiences that had led me to this moment. Why me? Maybe because you spent your life studying flight. Maybe because you were in the right place at the right time. Or maybe it chose you for reasons we'll never understand. Webb stood up, brushing dirt off his pants. "The question is, what do you do now?" I watched a rescue boat pull another piece of debris from the water. Somewhere out there, the Mothman was still watching, still waiting for the next disaster, the next chance to save lives. "I keep watching," I said. "I keep listening." Webb nodded slowly. "The TNT area restriction has been lifted. You can resume your research. But Miss Fieldstone, when it shows you something, when it tries to warn you, I hope you'll call us." He handed me a card with just a phone number printed on it. No name, no agency. "There are others like it," Webb said as he walked away. "Other places, other watchers. You might see them again." That was 3 months ago. The official investigation concluded that the Silver Bridge collapse was due to metal fatigue in a critical suspension cable. 46 people died that December evening, but it could have been much worse. Rush hour traffic was lighter than usual, and several cars that might have been on the bridge had been delayed by reports of a large bird causing a distraction. I went back to my research at the TNT area, but everything had changed. The dead birds were gone, cleared away by Webb's cleanup crews. The strange electromagnetic disturbances stopped. My cameras worked normally again, but I wasn't the same person who had started studying migration patterns that November. I'd learned that there are things in this world that science can't explain, mysteries that exist at the edges of our understanding. I keep detailed records now of every unusual animal behavior, every strange sighting. I've installed new equipment, not just cameras, but electromagnetic sensors, infrared detectors, anything that might help me document what others would dismiss as impossible. The Mothman hasn't returned to the TNT area, but I know it's still out there. Last month, I got reports of similar sightings near Charleston, just before that chemical plant explosion. 2 weeks ago, someone called in red eyes over Huntington, the night before that apartment building caught fire. I'm not the only one watching anymore. Webb was right, there are others. I've been contacted by researchers from all over Appalachia, people who've had their own encounters with things that shouldn't exist. We share information, compare notes, try to piece together patterns. Sometimes I wonder if I'm losing my objectivity as a scientist. A year ago, I would have laughed at anyone claiming to communicate telepathically with a giant bird creature. Now I carry Webb's card in my wallet and check emergency radio frequencies every night. But I've also learned something else. The Mothman and creatures like it aren't monsters. They're guardians. Watchers at the threshold between our world and whatever lies beyond. They try to warn us, to protect us, even though most people will never believe they exist. The night before I sat down to write this account, I had another vision. Brief, unclear, but enough to worry me. A school building, children running, smoke in the hallways, somewhere in the mountains, probably within the next few weeks. I've already called the number on Webb's card. People ask me if I'm afraid, living alone in the forest, knowing what's out there in the darkness. The truth is, I feel safer than I ever have. Somewhere in the sky above these mountains, ancient eyes are watching. If danger comes, if disaster threatens, I'll know. And maybe, if I'm very lucky, I'll be able to warn someone in time. My name is Dorothy Fieldstone, and I study birds. But now I know that not all the things with wings that soar through our skies are birds. Some of them are much, much more. Some of them are trying to save us. If you ever see red eyes watching from the darkness, if you hear that impossible sound echoing through the trees, don't run. Listen. The Mothman has something important to tell you. Your life might depend on it. My name is Henry Copperfield, and I've been a forest ranger for 15 years. Started back in 1956, right after I got out of the military police. Thought I'd seen everything a man could see during my service, but nothing prepared me for what I found in the Arkansas woods. I worked the Ouachita National Forest, specifically the Fouke Mountain region. It's wild country down here, thick swamps, cypress trees so old they were saplings when my grandfather was born, and bottomland forests so dense you can get lost 50 feet from a main trail. Most folks stay away from this part of Arkansas. Too remote, too wild, too many old stories. In my 15 years out here, I've investigated over 200 reports of strange animals. Bears walking upright, wild dogs the size of ponies, cats bigger than anything that should exist in Arkansas. Every single time, I found a logical explanation. Shadows playing tricks, regular animals seen from bad angles, or just plain old lies from folks wanting attention. I was the guy who debunked the monster stories. The voice of reason. When families called about creatures in their yards, I showed up with my camera, my plaster casting kit, and my complete confidence that whatever they saw had 4 legs and a Latin name in some biology textbook. Never believed in Bigfoot stories. Thought they were all hoaxes. Until September 1971, when I tracked one for 3 weeks through the deepest part of Fouke Mountain. It started with a call from Sheriff Morrison on a Tuesday morning. "Henry, we got another one of those creature reports. Family about 20 miles out from Fouke Town, up on the mountain. Say something big is bothering their property." I loaded my truck with the usual gear. 35mm camera, tape recorder, plaster of Paris for footprint casting, measuring tape. The drive out took me an hour on logging roads that hadn't seen maintenance since the lumber company pulled out in '68. The deeper I went, the quieter everything got. That should have been my first warning. The Hendricks family lived in a small farmhouse surrounded by cleared land that was slowly losing its battle with the encroaching forest. Jim Hendricks met me at his front porch, hat in his hands, looking like a man who hadn't slept much. "Ranger Copperfield, thank God you're here. That thing came back again last night. I'd heard this story before. Tell me what you saw, Mr. Hendricks." Didn't see it clear, but I heard it. Walking around the house, heavy steps, real heavy. Then it did something that made my blood run cold. He paused, glancing toward the tree line. It called my name, in my own voice. His wife appeared in the doorway, pale and shaky. "Show him the shed, Jim." We walked around back, and I stopped dead in my tracks. Their tool shed looked like something had grabbed the roof and peeled it back like opening a can of beans. The metal sheeting was twisted and thrown 20 feet away. The wooden frame underneath was splintered. "What kind of tools you keep in there?" I asked, pulling out my camera. "Just garden stuff. Shovels, hose, bag of fertilizer." Jim kicked at a piece of bent metal. "Nothing worth stealing." I photographed everything, took measurements, looked for footprints in the soft ground around the shed. found them too. Or rather, found something that made me question everything I thought I knew about the animals in these woods. The prints were 17 inches long, looked like a giant human foot, but with toes that ended in what might have been claws. The stride length between prints suggested whatever made them stood about 9 feet tall. I made plaster casts, measured everything twice, took photos from every angle. "Mr. Hendricks, you got any neighbors who might be playing pranks?" He shook his head. "Nearest folks are 12 miles off. Besides, you see the size of them prints?" I had to admit I'd never seen anything like them, but there had to be an explanation. Maybe a black bear that had learned to walk upright for longer distances. Maybe someone with fake feet trying to scare the family. Maybe the prints were old and had swollen from rain. That night, I camped in my truck about a quarter mile from the Hendricks place. Figured if something was bothering them, I'd spot it and solve this mystery once and for all. I'd done night watches before. Always turned out to be nothing more exciting than a raccoon or an owl. Around midnight, I noticed something wrong. The normal night sounds, risey, crickets, tree frogs, the distant hooting of owls, had stopped completely. The forest had gone dead silent. In 15 years of woods experience, I'd learned that when nature goes quiet, there's usually a predator nearby. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the truck. The beam cut through the darkness, showing nothing but trees and shadows. But I could feel something watching me. You know that feeling, like eyes on the back of your neck. Every instinct from my military training was screaming that I wasn't alone. Then I heard it. My own voice, calling from deep in the swamp. Henry Copperfield. But I was standing right there. I knew for certain that I hadn't spoken. The voice was coming from about 100 yards into the tree line, and it sounded exactly like me. I've been trained to handle strange situations, but hearing your own voice calling from a dark swamp when you know you're alone, that's the kind of thing that makes your hands shake and your mouth go dry. I got back in my truck and locked the doors. Told myself it was just echoes, or maybe the family playing some kind of joke. But deep down, I knew I'd just encountered something that didn't belong in any textbook, something that was smart enough to learn human speech. The next morning, I drove back to the Hendricks place to ask more questions. What I found made me question everything I thought I knew about the natural world. Jim Hendricks was standing in his yard, staring at his house. Every window on the ground floor had massive handprints pressed against the glass from the outside. The prints were huge, easily 12 inches from thumb to pinky, and they were positioned about 8 feet off the ground. "They weren't there yesterday evening," Jim said when he saw me examining them. "Sarah noticed them when she went to make coffee this morning." I measured and photographed each print. The ridge patterns looked almost human, but the size was impossible. The positioning suggested whatever made them had been looking into their windows while the family slept. "Did you hear anything last night after I left?" "Nothing. That's what scares me most. Something that big should make noise walking around, but we didn't hear a thing." I spent the morning casting the handprints and taking detailed photographs. When I got back to the ranger station, I developed the film immediately. Every single photo was blank. Not overexposed, not underexposed, completely blank, like I'd never removed the lens cap. I checked my camera. It was working fine. Took test shots around the office, and they developed perfectly. But every photo from the Hendricks place showed nothing but black space. That afternoon, Sheriff Morrison called again. "Henry, we got 3 more families reporting the same kind of trouble, all within a 5-mile radius of the Hendricks place. Whatever's out there, it's getting bolder." I drove out to interview the other families. The stories were all similar. Something large moving around their properties at night, damaged buildings, and that same disturbing detail about hearing their own voices calling from the woods. At the Peterson farm, I found footprints leading from the tree line directly to their chicken coop. Every bird was dead, but not eaten. They were arranged in a perfect circle in the middle of the coop, necks broken cleanly. It looked deliberate, like a message. "What kind of animal kills chickens but doesn't eat them?" Mrs. Peterson asked. I didn't have an answer. In all my years studying animal behavior, I'd never seen anything like it. Predators kill to eat or to protect territory. They don't arrange their kills in geometric patterns. That evening, I set up a more serious surveillance operation. Brought my best camera equipment, a tape recorder, and my service pistol. If something was harassing these families, I was going to document it properly. I positioned myself in a deer blind about 200 yards from the Peterson place, with a clear view of their yard and the edge of the forest. The sun went down around 7, and by 8:30, the woods had gone quiet again. At 9:17 p.m., I saw it. Something massive moved between the trees at the forest edge. It was too dark to make out details, but whatever it was stood upright and moved with purpose. I raised my camera and started taking pictures, though I wasn't optimistic about the results after what happened that morning. The creature, and I had to start calling it that, stepped into the clearing near the Peterson house. Even in the dim starlight, I could see it was enormous. At least 9 feet tall, covered in dark hair, with arms that hung down past its knees. It moved like a man, but with a fluidity that seemed impossible for something so large. I held my breath and kept taking pictures. This was it. Proof that something unknown was living in these woods. Evidence that would change everything we thought we knew about wildlife in Arkansas. The creature approached the Peterson house and placed its hands against the kitchen window, just like at the Hendricks place. But then it did something that made my blood turn to ice. It turned and looked directly at me. From 200 yards away, in complete darkness, it had somehow spotted me in my camouflaged deer blind. We stared at each other for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then it opened its mouth and spoke in Mrs. Peterson's voice. "Help me, please help me." Mrs. Peterson was inside the house. I could see the glow from her television through the living room window. But I was hearing her voice coming from this impossible creature standing in her yard. I fumbled for my tape recorder, desperate to capture evidence of what I was witnessing. But when I looked up again, the creature was gone. Vanished into the darkness without a sound. I stayed in that deer blind until sunrise, shaking and trying to make sense of what I'd seen. When I developed the film the next day, once again, every single frame was blank. But the tape recorder had captured something. When I played it back, I heard Mrs. Peterson's voice clearly. "Help me, please help me." But underneath her words, almost too low to hear, was another sound. A deep, rumbling growl that didn't come from any human throat. That's when I knew I wasn't dealing with an unknown animal. I was dealing with something intelligent, something that could mimic human speech perfectly, and something that was deliberately making its presence known. The question was, what did it want? By the end of the first week, 5 more families had reported encounters. The pattern was always the same: property damage, handprints on windows, and the terrifying experience of hearing their own voices calling from the forest. But the creature was getting bolder. The Williams family called me out on a Thursday morning, voices shaking with fear. When I arrived, I found their front door standing wide open. Not broken down, opened, like someone had used the handle. "We locked it," Tom Williams insisted. "Double-checked it before bed. But when we woke up this morning, the door was open, and there were muddy footprints leading right through our living room. The prints were the same impossible size I'd been documenting all week. They led from the front door, through the living room, down the hallway, and stopped at the bedroom where the Williams' 8-year-old daughter slept. "Did you check on Amy?" I asked. "She's fine, sleeping like nothing happened." "But Ranger Copperfield," Tom's voice dropped to a whisper. "The thing was in our house. It could have hurt any of us." I followed the muddy trail back outside. The prints led to the edge of the woods and then disappeared. Like whatever made them had simply melted into the forest. That afternoon, I called my supervisor in Little Rock. "I need backup out here. This isn't a normal animal situation." "What exactly are you dealing with, Henry?" I tried to explain about the footprints, the property damage, the voice mimicry. Even to my own ears, it sounded crazy. "You think it's some kind of hoax?" I thought so at first. But the evidence doesn't support that theory. Whatever's out there is real, it's intelligent, and it's escalating its behavior. Do what you can with local law enforcement. We'll send someone down if things get worse. Things got worse that very night. I was parked outside the Williams place, maintaining my watch, when Sheriff Morrison's radio crackled with an emergency call. "All units. We have a situation at the old lumber camp on Fook Mountain. Possible fatalities." The lumber camp had been abandoned for 3 years, ever since the company pulled out. It was just rotting buildings and rusted equipment about 5 miles deeper into the woods. No reason for anyone to be out there, especially not at night. Morrison and I drove out together. our headlights cutting through the darkness on the narrow logging road. We found two vehicles parked near the main camp building, the pickup truck and a Jeep I recognized as belonging to the Morrison brothers, local hunters. Jake and Eddie went out spotlighting tonight, the sheriff said, looking for deer eyes to hunt this weekend. We called their names but got no answer. The silence in the woods was complete. No insects, no night birds, nothing. Just that unnatural quiet I'd been experiencing all week. We found Jake Morrison first. He was hanging upside down from a tree branch about 20 feet off the ground, suspended by a rope around his ankles. His neck was broken cleanly, but there wasn't a mark on the rest of his body. No wounds, no signs of struggle, no blood. Eddie was 50 yards away, positioned exactly the same way, hanging upside down, neck broken, no other injuries. Both bodies were arranged so they faced each other across a small clearing, like some kind of display. Jesus Christ, Morrison whispered. What the hell did this? I examined the scene with my flashlight. There were no human footprints around either tree, no drag marks, no signs of how the bodies had been positioned so high up. But at the base of each tree, pressed deep into the soft earth, were those same massive footprints I'd been documenting all week. Sheriff, we need to get out of here. Now. As we turned to leave, a voice called out from the darkness. Jake Morrison's voice, even though we'd just found Jake hanging dead from a tree. Help us, Sheriff. We're lost. Morrison spun around, his hand going to his gun. Jake, where are you? The voice came again, from a different direction. Over here, Sheriff. We can't find our way back. But now it was Eddie's voice, calling from somewhere behind us. I grabbed Morrison's arm. That's not them. We need to leave right now. Help us. Both voices called in unison, from different parts of the forest. We're scared. We ran back to the patrol car and didn't stop driving until we reached town. Morrison called the state police and the coroner, but he didn't mention the voices. Neither did I. Who would have believed us? The next morning, I went back to the lumber camp with the state investigators. They found the bodies exactly as we'd left them, but they had no precedent. Explanation for how two grown men had been positioned 20 feet up in trees with their necks broken and no signs of struggle. Probably some kind of hunting accident, the lead investigator concluded. Maybe they fell from a tree stand. But there were no tree stands. And tree stands don't explain how bodies end up hanging upside down from branches. I knew the truth, even if I couldn't prove it. The creature had killed Jake and Eddie Morrison, and it had arranged their bodies as a warning, a message to anyone who might be hunting in its territory. But the most terrifying part wasn't the deaths themselves. It was the realization that the creature had learned their voices while they were still alive. It had listened to them speak, memorized the sound, and then used their own words to try to lure us into the woods. Whatever we were dealing with wasn't just intelligent. It was a predator that could think, plan, and use psychological warfare against its enemies. And for some reason, it had chosen Fook Mountain as its territory. After the Morrison brothers' deaths, most families in the area packed up and left. Can't say I blamed them. The state police declared the lumber camp off limits and started patrolling the roads, but they couldn't patrol the entire forest. I should have left too. Should have requested a transfer to a safer district. But 15 years of investigating mysteries had taught me one thing. Running away never solves anything. Whatever was in those woods was real. It was intelligent, and it was my responsibility to understand it. On a Friday night, exactly 3 weeks after the first Hendricks report, I made a decision that changed everything. Instead of watching from a distance, I was going to enter the creature's territory and force a direct confrontation. I loaded my pack with 3 days of supplies, my camera equipment, and my service weapon. Not that I thought a pistol would do much good against something that could hang two grown men from trees, but it made me feel slightly better. The plan was simple. Hike deep into the swamp where the sightings had been concentrated, set up camp, and wait for the creature to find me. Because I was certain it would. Everything I'd observed suggested it was actively monitoring human activity in its territory. I left detailed notes about my location with Sheriff Morrison, along with instructions to call the state police if I didn't return by Monday morning. Then I drove out to the deepest access point I could reach by truck and started walking. The woods felt wrong from the moment I stepped off the logging road. Not just quiet, actively hostile. Every shadow seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at it. Every sound I made seemed too loud, like I was announcing my presence to something that was already watching. I hiked for 4 hours before reaching the area where I wanted to make camp. It was a small clearing beside a cypress-lined creek, about as remote as you could get in the Ouachita National Forest. Perfect for what I had in mind. I set up my tent, built a small fire, and prepared to wait. I didn't have to wait long. As soon as the sun went down, the forest went silent. But this time, I could feel the presence almost immediately. Something large was moving through the trees around my clearing, staying just outside the circle of firelight. At 9:30, it spoke. Henry Copperfield. My own voice, calling from the darkness. "I'm here," I called back. "I know you're out there. What do you want?" The response came from a different direction, still in my voice. "Why are you here, Henry?" This wasn't like the random voice mimicry I'd witnessed before. The creature was having a conversation with me, using my own voice to ask intelligent questions. "I want to understand what you are. Are you going to hurt me, Henry?" The question caught me off guard. The creature was asking if I intended harm. It understood the concept of threat assessment. "No, I'm not going to hurt you." Silence for several minutes. Then, slowly, it stepped into the light. I'd seen it from a distance before, but nothing had prepared me for encountering the creature face to face. It stood at least 9 feet tall, covered in dark brown hair that seemed to absorb the firelight. Its face was almost human, but larger, with intelligent eyes that reflected the flames like a cat's. But the most unsettling thing was how it moved. Despite its massive size, it had stepped into my clearing without making a sound. It stood there studying me with obvious intelligence, head tilted slightly like it was trying to solve a puzzle. "You are different from the others," it said, still using my voice. "You came alone. You brought no weapons to hunt me. You can see my pistol. That is not a hunting weapon. That is for protection." The creature took a step closer. "You are afraid, but you came anyway. Why?" I realized I was having the most important conversation of my life with something that shouldn't exist, and I needed to choose my words carefully. "Because you're killing people. The Morrison brothers. You're scaring families out of their homes. They came into my territory with weapons. They hunt my forests without permission." The creature's eyes narrowed. "The families build their houses on my land and act surprised when I investigate them." "Your land? My people have lived in these mountains for longer than your kind has existed. We were here before your trees fell, before your roads scarred the earth." The creature sat down across the fire from me, a casual gesture that was somehow more terrifying than any threat. "You build and build and build, always pushing deeper into places that do not belong to you." I was talking to something that claimed to be ancient, something that viewed human expansion as an invasion of its ancestral territory. And based on what I'd witnessed, it had the power to defend its claims. "The families didn't know. They don't understand this is your territory. Now they do." The creature leaned forward, and I caught a scent like rich earth and old rain. "The question is, what will you do with this knowledge, Henry Copperfield? What do you want me to do? Tell your people to stay away from the deep woods. Tell them that some places are not meant for human houses and human roads." The creature stood up, towering over me even across the fire. "Tell them that we are watching and we will defend what is ours. And if they don't listen?" The creature smiled, showing teeth that were definitely not human. "Then there will be more displays like the Morrison brothers." Before I could respond, it turned and melted back into the darkness, moving silently despite its enormous size. I sat by that fire until dawn, shaking and trying to process what had just happened. I'd made contact with an intelligent species that claimed to be the original inhabitants of these mountains. A species that viewed human expansion as an invasion and was willing to kill to defend its territory, and it had chosen me as its messenger. I hiked out of the woods the next morning with more questions than answers. How do you report a conversation with a creature that isn't supposed to exist? How do you explain that the Fook Mountain region is inhabited by an intelligent species that's been here longer than human civilization? I tried. God help me, I tried. I filed a complete report with my supervisors, documenting everything I'd witnessed and experienced over those 3 weeks. I included photographs of the footprints, plaster casts, measurements, and detailed accounts of every encounter. They read my report and quietly transferred me to a desk job in Little Rock. Stress reaction, they called it. Too many years in the deep woods can affect a man's judgment. Sheriff Morrison backed up my GID story, but he was facing re-election and couldn't afford to be known as the sheriff who believed in monsters. The state police ruled the Morrison deaths as hunting accidents and closed the case. Within 6 months, the families who'd stayed in the area stopped reporting creature encounters. Either the thing had moved on, or they'd learned not to talk about what they saw. But I knew the truth. The creature hadn't moved on. It had simply retreated deeper into the wilderness, watching and waiting. 3 years later, in 1974, the federal government declared a large section of the Ouachita National Forest around Fook Mountain as a protected wilderness area. No logging, no development, no hunting allowed. The official reason was to preserve endangered species habitat. But I know the real reason. Someone, somewhere in the government, believed my report. They understood that there are things in these mountains that are older and more dangerous than we want to admit. I still work for the Forest Service, but now I spend my days pushing papers and reviewing reports from other rangers. Sometimes, late at night, I get calls from rangers in remote areas who found impossible footprints or heard voices calling from empty woods. I listen to their stories and file their reports under unusual animal activity. Then I make a phone call to a number I'm not supposed to have, and within a week, those areas get declared off-limits for environmental protection. The Fook monster sightings stopped after 1971, but that doesn't mean the creature is gone. It just means it learned to stay hidden. It learned that humans will invade any territory that isn't officially protected. Sometimes I drive out to the edge of the wilderness area and park on the old logging roads. Just sit there and listen to the forest. Every now and then, when the wind is right, I hear something moving through the trees. Something large, something intelligent, something that remembers our fiery conversation by the campfire. I'm 60 years old now, and I'll be retiring soon. But before I do, I want people to know the truth about what's out there in the deep woods. Not just in Arkansas, but in wild places all across the country. We're not alone on this continent. We never have been. And the things that were here first are still watching us, still defending their territory, still deciding whether humanity is a threat that needs to be eliminated. The Morrison brothers learned that lesson too late. The families around Fook Mountain learned it just in time. The question is, what will the rest of us do when we finally come face to face with the original inhabitants of these ancient forests? Because eventually, we will. Our cities keep growing, our roads keep pushing deeper into the wilderness, and sooner or later, we're going to build something in the wrong place. And when that happens, they'll remind us, just like they reminded me, that some territories were never ours to claim. I hope when that day comes, we're smart enough to listen. Because the alternative is more bodies hanging from trees, arranged in perfect displays to send a message that primitive human brains might finally understand. We are not the apex predators we think we are. We never were. My name is Margaret Ironwood, and for 22 years I thought I understood the night. I've been a ranger in Daniel Boone National Forest since 1954, back when they still called us Lady Rangers, like it was something unusual. I earned my biology PhD studying bat colonies in Kentucky's cave systems, spent 2 decades mapping over 50 different caves in the Red River Gorge, and I can rappel down a 100-foot cliff face in the dark if I need to. The forest rangers in 3 counties call me when they find something dead they can't explain, because I know how predators think. I know what kills what, and how, and why. Or at least, I thought I did. October in the gorge is my favorite time of year. The sandstone cliffs turn golden in the afternoon sun, and the hickory trees drop their leaves in thick carpets that smell like earth and smoke. The tourists thin out after Labor Day, leaving just the serious rock climbers who come for the tall walls and the perfect autumn weather. It's peaceful then. Just me, the caves, and the quiet rhythm of nocturnal life that most people never see. I was checking on the Morrison Cave Colony on October 12th, 1976, when I first knew something was wrong. I'd been monitoring this particular colony of Indiana bats for 3 years. Every fall, they'd gather in Morrison's main chamber, about 2,000 of them preparing for hibernation. I'd hike up to the cave entrance every Tuesday evening, set up my equipment, and count them as they emerged for their nightly feeding. The numbers stayed consistent, give or take 100 bats. Predictable, scientific, normal. That Tuesday, not a single bat flew out. I waited until full dark, checked my bat detector twice, even went into the cave with my carbide lamp to see if they were just running late. The limestone chamber was empty. 2,000 bats don't just disappear. They don't relocate an entire colony overnight. It doesn't happen. My hands shook as I wrote up my field notes. In 22 years, I'd never seen anything like it. I told myself there had to be a rational explanation. Pesticides maybe, though we'd banned DDT years ago. A fungus, perhaps, something new we hadn't identified yet. I made plans to check the other cave systems in the morning, to survey the whole gorge network. Science would give me an answer. It always did. I hiked back to my truck just after midnight, following my trail by flashlight through the oak forest. The beam caught something on the path ahead, scratch marks, deep ones, carved into the bark of a massive sycamore tree. I moved closer, running my fingers over the gouges. They were 6 inches long, parallel, 4 of them like claw marks, but placed 8 feet up the trunk. Bears can stand on their hind legs, I thought. A big male could reach that high. But these marks were fresh, the wood still pale and oozing sap. And something about the pattern bothered me. The angle was wrong. These didn't rake downward like a bear stretching up. They raked across, horizontal, like something had been climbing and needed to grip the trunk. I stood there in the dark, listening. The forest was silent, completely silent. No crickets, no owls, no rustling of mice in the leaf litter. Just wind moving through empty branches, and somewhere far off, the sound of water trickling over stone. In all my years in these woods, I'd never heard it this quiet. I walked faster back to my truck, telling myself I was being foolish. I was a scientist, not some superstitious local who believed in the beast of bluegrass stories the old-timers liked to tell. Those were just legends the moonshiners made up back in Prohibition, trying to scare away the revenue agents. Ghost stories to keep people out of the hollow where they ran their stills. But my hand was gripping my flashlight like a weapon, and I didn't stop walking until I was inside my truck with the doors locked. I drove back to the Crook Ranger station with my windows up and my radio turned loud, trying to drown out the memory of that silence. The next 3 nights, I checked every major cave system in the Red River Gorge. Cloud Splitter Cave, empty. Chimney Top Cave, empty. Indian Creek Caverns, empty. Every single bat colony had vanished, thousands of them, gone without a trace. On the 4th night, I found the deer. It was a doe, sprawled across the trail near Sky Bridge, one of the massive sandstone arches that makes the gorge famous. I almost walked past it in the dark. My flashlight caught the white of her belly first, then the rest. She'd been killed recently, maybe an hour before. Still warm, but the way she'd been killed made me stop cold. Her throat was torn open, neat and precise. A killing bite, exactly where a predator would strike. That part was normal. What wasn't normal was everything else. The deer hadn't been eaten. She'd been arranged, almost carefully, laid out in the center of the trail with her legs tucked under her body and her head turned to face the path I'd been walking, like someone wanted me to find her. I knelt down, examining the wound with my flashlight. The bite radius was huge. The punctures were spaced too far apart for a coyote, too wide for even a mountain lion. And mountain lions don't live in Kentucky anymore. We hunted them all out 50 years ago. Something crunched in the woods behind me. I spun around, flashlight swinging. The beam caught trees, shadows, nothing else. My heart hammered against my ribs. Hello? My voice sounded small in the darkness. Another crunch, off to my left now. Deliberate. Heavy footfalls on the leaf litter, but I couldn't see anything moving. Whatever it was staying just outside my light. I'm an armed ranger, I called out, which was half true. I had pepper spray on my belt and a radio I could use to call for help. Identify yourself. The footsteps stopped. The silence rushed. Back in, thick and suffocating. I stood there with my light pointed into the trees, breathing hard, waiting. 30 seconds passed. A minute. Nothing moved. Then I heard it. A sound like nothing I'd ever heard before, low and resonant, more vibration than noise. It started deep, subsonic, rattling in my chest like a bass drum. Then it rose, climbing into a howl that made my skin go cold. It wasn't a wolf howl, though it was close. This had something else in it, something that sounded almost human, like a voice was buried inside the sound, trying to form words. The howl echoed off the sandstone cliffs, bouncing through the gorge, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Then it cut off. I ran. I don't care how that sounds. I'm 50 years old with a PhD and 2 decades of field experience, and I ran like a child. I ran back down the trail with my flashlight bouncing wild, my breath coming in gasps, branches whipping at my face. I didn't stop until I reached my truck, and I didn't look back because some part of my brain, some ancient part that still remembered being prey, told me not to. I radioed the station from my truck, hands shaking so bad I could barely hold the receiver. This is Ranger Ironwood at Skybridge. I need to report unusual animal activity. Possible large predator. The dispatcher, Jimmy Chen, responded with his usual calm. What kind of predator, Margaret? I stared out at the dark forest, trying to find words. I don't know. Something big, really big. Bear. Maybe. But I didn't believe it. You want backup? I almost said yes. Then I thought about how that would sound, veteran ranger scared by some noises in the woods, calling for help like it's her first week. No, just log it. I'm heading back. I drove to the station with my high beams on, checking my rearview mirror every few seconds. When I got home that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing that howl in my head, kept seeing the doe laid out on the trail like an offering. I pulled out my old folklore books, the ones I'd collected over the years, more as curiosities than references. Kentucky legends, Cherokee stories, Appalachian ghost tales. I found The Beast of Bluegrass in a thin volume published in 1923. The entry was short. Asterisk, local legend speaks of a creature that guards the Red River Gorge, appearing during the full moon. Said to be the spirit of a wronged man, cursed to protect the hollow from those who would despoil it. Moonshiners claim to have seen it on the cliffs, a wolf that walked like a man, with eyes that glowed like lanterns. Asterisk, I checked the calendar on my wall. Tonight had been the first night of the full moon. The moon would be full for 2 more nights. I didn't go back into the gorge that next day. Instead, I drove into town and talked to Sheriff Porter, a grizzled man who'd lived in these hills his whole life. Livestock killings? He said, leaning back in his chair. Yeah, we've had a few. Thought it was just wild dogs at first, but... He trailed off, studying me. Why you asking, Margaret? Found a deer kill that looks strange. Wanted to know if there's a pattern. He pulled out a file, spread some photos on his desk. 3 dead goats, 2 sheep, all killed the same way, throat torn out, barely eaten, arranged in neat positions. All of them during the full moon, past 3 months. Farmers are getting spooked. I picked up one of the photos. The goat's eyes were still open, reflecting the camera flash. Anyone seen what's doing it? Old Eddie Marsh claims he saw something on his property 2 nights ago. Said it was standing on 2 legs by his barn, watching his sheep. But Eddie's 80 and half blind, so... Porter shrugged. What do you think it is? I don't know yet. That was a lie. I was starting to have an idea, and I hated it. I spent the afternoon at the public library, digging through archives. Found newspaper articles from the 1,920 seconds about the moonshiners who operated in Red River Gorge during Prohibition. One name kept appearing. Silas Hargrove, who ran the biggest still in the hollow. The revenue agents chased him for years, but never caught him. In 1924, he disappeared. The last article I found was just 3 sentences. Asterisk Silas Hargrove, 34, has not been seen since October 15th. Local Cherokee elder John Whitefeather claims Hargrove violated sacred ground. Search called off after 2 weeks. Asterisk October 15th, 1924. Exactly 52 years ago. That night was the second full moon night. I should have stayed home. Every rational part of my brain told me to stay home, lock my doors, and wait for the moon to wane. But I'm a scientist. I needed to see. I drove back to the gorge just after sunset, parking at the Skybridge trailhead. I had my flashlight, my radio, my camera, and a canister of bear spray that suddenly felt very inadequate. The plan was simple. Hike to the ridge overlook, watch the cave entrances with my binoculars, document whatever I saw. The forest was dead silent again. No birds settling for the night, no insects, nothing. Just my boots on the trail and the sound of my own breathing. I reached the overlook as the moon rose, huge and orange over the eastern cliffs. From here, I could see 3 different cave entrances across the gorge, dark holes in the sandstone walls, some of them 60 feet up the cliff face. I set up my equipment and waited. The moon climbed higher, turning white and bright, the gorge filled with silver light, casting deep shadows under the rock overhangs. I scanned each cave entrance with my binoculars, looking for movement. At 9:47 p.m., I saw it. Something emerged from Morrison Cave, the one I'd checked first. It came out slowly, gripping the rock face with hands, not paws, hands that ended in long claws. The moonlight caught its fur, thick and dark. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, built like a man but shaped wrong. The legs were too long, bent backward at the knee like a wolf's. The head was huge and elongated, with pointed ears that swiveled independent of each other. It clung to the vertical cliff face like gravity meant nothing. Then it turned its head and looked directly at me. Its eyes glowed, actually glowed like there was light behind them, amber and bright even across 200 yards of empty air. I stopped breathing. My hands froze on the binoculars. The creature stared at me for what felt like an hour but was probably 10 seconds. Then it moved, flowing up the cliff face with impossible speed, claws finding holds in stone that looked smooth from this distance. It reached the top of the ridge in seconds and disappeared over the edge. Heading toward me, I grabbed my equipment and ran back down the trail, my scientific objectivity completely gone. Behind me, I could hear something moving through the forest, not on the trail, but through the trees, parallel to my path. Something big, keeping pace with me easily, crashing through underbrush that I couldn't see. My flashlight caught movement to my right. A shadow, flowing between the trees, too large and too fast. I ran harder, my lungs burning. The trailhead was close, just another quarter mile. My truck was there, safety was there, locked doors and steel, and something landed on the trail ahead of me. I skidded to a stop, my flashlight swinging up. It stood in the middle of the path, blocking my way. 8 feet of muscle and fur and teeth, standing on 2 legs like a man but hunched forward, balanced on the balls of its feet. Its hands, God, they really were hands, with fingers and thumbs flexed at its sides, claws scraping together. Its muzzle was pulled back in something between a snarl and a grin, showing teeth that belonged in a nightmare. But its eyes were the worst part. They glowed with that amber light, and behind the animal fury, I saw something that looked almost human, something aware, something that recognized me. "Please," I whispered, though I don't know what I was asking for. The creature tilted its head, studying me. Its nostrils flared, scenting the air. Then it opened its mouth and spoke. Not words, exactly, but sounds that were trying to be words, shaped by a throat and mouth that weren't built for human speech. A low rumble that might have been go or no or something else entirely. Then it stepped aside. I didn't question it. I ran past, giving it a wide berth, my whole body shaking. It didn't move as I passed, just watched me with those terrible glowing eyes. I reached my truck, fumbled my keys, finally got the door open. As I started the engine, I looked back at the trail. The creature was gone, but in the moonlight, I could see fresh claw marks on a tree beside where it had stood, 4 parallel gouges, 8 feet up the trunk. I didn't sleep that night. Didn't even try. I sat at my kitchen table with every light in the house on, drinking coffee and trying to make sense of what I'd seen. A werewolf. The word felt ridiculous, even thinking it. Werewolves were folklore, fairy tales, movie monsters. They weren't real. They couldn't be real. But I'd seen it. I had claw marks on film, evidence, data. And that sound it had made, those almost words, meant it wasn't just an animal. It was intelligent. It was aware. It had let me go. At sunrise, I drove back into town and found John Whitefeather's grandson, Tom, who ran a small museum of Cherokee history. I'd met him a few times at cultural heritage meetings. He was a quiet man, maybe 60, with deep-set eyes and careful hands. "I need to know about Silas Hargrove," I said. Tom's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. "Why?" "Because something is happening in the gorge. Something that happened 52 years ago, too. And I think it started with him." Tom was quiet for a long moment. Then he poured us both coffee and sat down. "My grandfather was a medicine man," he said. "He took care of the old places, kept the sacred sites protected. The gorge was one of them, caves that went deep, where our ancestors buried their dead and left offerings. Then Prohibition came, and men like Hargrove moved in. They set up their stills in the caves, destroyed burial sites, dumped chemicals in the underground streams. Your grandfather cursed him, I said. My grandfather gave him a choice, Tom corrected. Leave the caves alone or protect them forever. Hargrove laughed in his face, said he'd set up a still in every cave in the gorge if he wanted. Tom's jaw tightened. 3 days later, on the full moon, Hargrove went into the caves and never came out. Not as himself, anyway. He became the beast. Tom nodded slowly. The curse binds him to the gorge. Every full moon, he transforms, and he guards the caves from anyone who would harm them. Miners, developers, vandals, anyone who comes with destruction in their heart. My grandfather said the curse would last until the land itself forgave him. Does it kill people? Only those who deserve it. There were some cave explorers in the 50s, planning to blast open new passages for tours. They disappeared during a full moon. Revenue agents found their bodies later, positioned at the cave entrances like sentinels. He met my eyes. But you're still alive, Margaret. Why do you think that is? I thought about the creature stepping aside, letting me pass. Because I protect the caves too. You respect them, Tom said. That's what matters. I drove back to the gorge as the sun set, beginning the third and final night of the full moon. I wasn't running anymore. I had questions, and somehow I knew where to find answers. I hiked up to Morrison Cave in the twilight, my flashlight off, walking by the last of the daylight. The forest was silent again, holding its breath. I reached the cave entrance and stopped. I know what you are, I called into the darkness. I know about Silas Hargrove. Nothing answered. The cave mouth was black and deep. I'm not here to hurt the caves, I continued. I've spent 22 years protecting them, studying them. I've kept out the developers and the vandals and the people who want to turn this place into a tourist trap. I've been doing what you do, just in a different way. The moon rose behind me, full and bright. In the cave, something moved. The beast emerged slowly, stepping into the moonlight. This close, I could see details I'd missed before: the intelligence in those glowing eyes, the old scars crossing its fur, the way it moved with both animal grace and human purpose. It was terrifying and magnificent and impossibly sad. I need to understand, I said, keeping my voice steady. The bats left. Why did they leave? The creature tilted its head. Then it turned and walked into the cave. After a moment, I followed. My eyes adjusted slowly to the darkness. The creature's eyes provided some light, glowing amber markers ahead of me. It led me deeper into Morrison Cave, through passages I'd mapped years ago, until we reached the main chamber. The bats were there. All of them, thousands upon thousands, clustered on the ceiling in a massive colony. But they weren't hibernating, they were awake, shifting and chittering nervously. The beast gestured with one clawed hand toward the far wall. I approached carefully, shining my flashlight where it indicated. Someone had been spray painting the cave wall. Fresh paint, bright orange, spelled out Jackson's Climbing Tours, with an arrow pointing deeper into the system. Below it, someone had started drilling fresh holes in the ancient limestone, prepping to install permanent climbing anchors. My blood went cold. This was a protected site. These caves were off-limits to commercial development. Someone had violated every regulation we had, planning to turn sacred burial caves into a climbing gym. I turned back to the beast. It was watching me, waiting. I'll stop them, I said. I'll report this, get it shut down, press charges. I'll protect these caves. The creature stepped closer. This close, I could smell it wild and earthy, like stone and rain and old leaves. It reached out one massive hand and touched my shoulder, carefully, like it was afraid of breaking me. Its claws pricked through my jacket, just barely. Where they touched skin, I felt a jolt run through me, cold fire, moonlight made solid, something ancient and powerful that made every nerve in my body sing. The beast pulled back and made that sound again, the almost word, the shape of language its throat couldn't quite form. But this time, I understood. Asterisk, sister. Asterisk. Then it turned and loped deeper into the caves, disappearing into darkness. I stood there for a long moment, my shoulder tingling where it had touched me. Then I walked back out into the moonlight and radioed the station. We caught Jackson's climbing tours 3 days later, trying to install more equipment in the caves. I had photographs, evidence, and 22 years of credibility with the Forest Service. They lost their business license and paid hefty fines. The Park Service implemented new restrictions, no cliff access during full moon periods, increased ranger patrols, and severe penalties for anyone caught damaging the caves. The official report said we were protecting sensitive bat habitats. That was true enough. The bats came back after that, settling into their regular patterns. The forest filled with sound again, crickets and owls and all the small rustlings of nocturnal life. The silence lifted like a held breath finally released. But something changed in me that night in the cave. Now, when the full moon rises, I feel it. A tingling in my bones, an awareness of the lunar cycle that goes deeper than any calendar. I can sense when the transformation is coming. I can feel the presence of the beast even when I can't see it. I'm not cursed, not like Hargrove, but I'm connected now, bound to the gorge in a way that goes beyond my ranger duties. I'm a guardian, same as the beast, just serving in my own way. Sometimes on full moon nights, I hike up to the ridges and watch the cave entrances. I've seen the beast a dozen times now, always from a distance. It patrols the gorge, checking on the sacred sites, making sure the caves stay protected. Once, I swear it nodded to me across the gap before disappearing back into Morrison Cave. I'm 50 years old, and I've started hearing stories from other rangers in the Appalachian chain. Tales of lunar guardians in the Smokies, wolf spirits in the Blue Ridge, creatures that protect the old places from those who would destroy them. Maybe there are more like Hargrove, bound by old curses to serve the land they once violated. Or maybe there are other kinds of guardians, born from the mountains themselves. I don't know. But I know this. The wild places have their own protectors. They always have. And if you come into the forest with respect, if you treat the caves and the cliffs and the ancient stones with the reverence they deserve, you'll have nothing to fear. But if you come to exploit or destroy, if you bring harm to these sacred spaces, well, just make sure you check the calendar first. And whatever you do, stay out of the gorge when the moon is full. My name is Margaret Ironwood, and I'm a ranger in Daniel Boone National Forest. I've been here 22 years, and I plan to stay another 22 if I can. Someone needs to watch over these hills. And on full moon nights, I don't watch alone. My name is Catherine Mountainheart, and for 19 years I've been a park ranger in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. I know these peaks better than my own backyard. Every trail, every ridge, every hidden valley where the rare plants grow. I've got a PhD in botany, sure, but the mountains taught me more than any classroom ever could. People always ask me about the name Mountainheart. My grandmother gave it to me when I was little. She said it meant pure guardian of the mountain's core. Sounds fancy, but really, it just means I take care of these hills and everything that lives on them. January 1974 was the coldest winter I'd ever seen up here. The kind of cold that bites through 3 layers of wool and still finds your bones. I was 45 then, been a widow for 6 years, and these mountains were pretty much all the family I had left. My specialty was alpine ecology, Shigsta, studying the tough little plants that somehow survive above 5,000 feet where the wind never stops howling. I never believed in the old stories. You know the ones, Ace, Wendigo tales that folks said came from up north, around the Great Lakes. Cherokee elders sometimes whispered about hunger spirits during the worst winters, but I always figured that was just old-time ways of explaining starvation and desperation. Made sense to me. When people get hungry enough, cold enough, desperate enough, they do terrible things. No monsters needed. Should have listened to those elders. The trouble started on January 15th. I was supposed to meet a research team up on Grandfather Mountain, DOD, 3 graduate students and their professor from Appalachian State. They were studying how alpine plants survive extreme cold, and I was their local guide. Smart kids, all of them. The professor, Dr. Marcus Webb, had been doing this kind of work for 20 years. The team was supposed to radio in every evening at 6. Standard protocol when you're that high up in winter. On the 15th, nothing. Radio, silence. First day, I wasn't too worried. Equipment fails, batteries die in the cold, things happen. Second day, I started getting anxious. These weren't weekend hikers. They knew the mountains. By the third day, when the blizzard hit and I still hadn't heard anything, I knew something was very wrong. The storm came down like the mountain was angry. Wind speeds over 60 miles per hour, temperatures dropping to 20 below zero. The kind of weather that kills you if you make even one small mistake. Roads got closed, power lines went down, and our radio communications got all scrambled up. But I couldn't just sit there. Not when 4 people might be dying up on those peaks. I've been doing high-altitude rescues for almost 2 decades. I know what gear you need, what signs to look for, how to move fast and safe when every minute counts. My truck was loaded with everything: medical supplies, emergency shelter, extra food, alpine rescue equipment. I even had my grandfather's old Cherokee medicine bundle, though I wasn't sure why I grabbed it. The drive up Grandfather Mountain took 3 hours instead of the usual one. I had to stop 6 times to dig my truck out of snowdrifts. The whole time, the wind was howling like something alive and angry. When I finally reached the trailhead, where the team's vehicles were parked, I could barely see 10 feet in any direction. Their cars were buried under 4 feet of snow. Been there for days. I strapped on my snowshoes and started climbing. The team's base camp was about 2 miles up the trail and another 1,000 feet of elevation. In good weather, it's a nice walk. In that blizzard, every step was a fight. The weird thing was the silence. I mean, sure, the wind was loud, but underneath that, nothing. No birds, no squirrels, no sound of small animals moving through the snow. In 19 years on these mountains, I'd never heard quiet like that. Even in the worst storms, there's always some kind of life-making noise. This felt like death itself had settled over the peaks. As I climbed higher, the feeling got stronger. Something was very wrong up there. Not just missing people wrong, something deeper, older, hungrier. The kind of wrong that makes your stomach twist up and your hands shake for no good reason. I should have turned back right then. Should have waited for better weather, called for backup, done anything except keep climbing toward whatever was waiting in that camp. But those were my people up there. My responsibility. And if they were still alive, I was probably their only chance. I found the research camp just as the sun was going down. What was left of it, anyway. The tents were still standing, which surprised me. In wind like that, camp gear usually gets shredded pretty quick. But these tents looked almost arranged, like someone had very carefully placed them in a perfect circle around what used to be a campfire. The fire pit was the first thing that made my skin crawl. It was still warm. I could feel heat coming off it even through my thick gloves, but there was no wood in it. No logs, no kindling, nothing that should burn. Just a pile of white ash, with red embers still glowing underneath. And bones. Lots of bones. At first I thought maybe they'd been cooking rabbits or something. Emergency food when their supplies ran low. But these bones were too big for rabbits. Too big for deer, even. Some of them looked almost. I tried not to think about what they looked like. I called out for the team. Dr. Webb, Sarah, anyone. The wind grabbed my voice and threw it away like it was nothing. No answer came back. The first tent I checked belonged to Sarah Chen, one of the graduate students. A sweet kid, maybe 24, studying rare mountain flowers. Her sleeping bag was still there, but it was torn open from the inside. Long, jagged tears like someone had clawed their way out. Her research notes were scattered, everywhere, but when I tried to read them, the pages were covered in strange drawings. Not flower sketches. These were pictures of people eating. Really detailed drawings of people biting and chewing and swallowing. The handwriting started normal at the beginning of the notebook, but by the end it was wild and shaky, like she'd been drawing while her hands were shaking. The last entry just said, "So hungry," over and over again, filling up 3 whole pages. The second tent was worse. Tommy Rodriguez, another grad student, his sleeping bag was completely shredded, and there were dark stains all over everything. The smell hit me like a punch to the stomach, metallic and rotten, and something else I couldn't name but made me want to throw up. His research equipment was still there, but someone had arranged it in weird patterns. Thermometers laid out in spirals, specimen jars lined up like they were marching somewhere. And in the center of it all, Tommy's field journal, open to a page that just had one sentence written over and over. "It's never enough." By the time I got to the third tent, My hands were shaking so bad I could barely work the zipper. This one belonged to Linda Park, the team's photographer. She was supposed to be documenting how the plants survived winter conditions. Her cameras were smashed. Not just broken, completely destroyed, like someone had taken a rock and pounded them into pieces. But the weird thing was, all the film was missing. Every roll, every cartridge, gone. And written on the tent wall in what looked like charcoal were dozens of words in a language I didn't recognize. The professor's tent was the last one, and the biggest. Dr. Webb was a careful man, organized, always followed protocol. His tent should have been neat and tidy even in an emergency. Instead, it looked like a tornado had hit it. Everything was destroyed, torn apart, scattered. His radio equipment was in pieces. His medical supplies were gone. His food stores, Haval, 3 weeks' worth of emergency rations, completely empty. But in the center of all that destruction, his research journal was sitting perfectly clean and undamaged. I picked it up with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The first half was normal research notes, temperature readings, plant observations, weather data. But somewhere around day 5, the handwriting changed, got messy and desperate looking. Team showing signs of extreme hunger despite adequate food supplies. One entry said, "Appetite seems impossible to satisfy." Sarah ate an entire day's rations in one sitting and immediately asked for more. A few pages later, Tommy caught eating raw vegetation, plants that should be toxic, claims he can't help himself. Something is wrong here. And then, near the end, Linda tried to eat her camera film, had to physically restrain her. We're all affected now. The hunger is spreading. It's not natural. Something is calling to us, telling us to feed on each other. The final entry was just one line, written in huge, shaky letters. "It's coming for the bones." I dropped the journal and stumbled backward out of the tent. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might burst. These weren't random disappearances or accident victims. Something had gotten into these people's heads, made them crazy with hunger, turned them against each other. That's when I heard the first whisper. It came through my radio, even though I hadn't turned it on. A soft, scratchy voice speaking words I couldn't understand, but somehow felt in my bones. The voice was hungry. So hungry it made my own stomach cramp up with sudden, desperate need for food. I switched the radio off, but the whispering kept going, getting louder, getting clearer, and I realized it wasn't coming from the radio anymore. It was coming from somewhere up the mountain. The tracks appeared the next morning. I'd spent the night huddled in my emergency shelter, too scared to sleep much. Every sound the wind made seemed like footsteps. Every creak of settling snow felt like something moving around outside. When dawn finally came, gray and cold through the blizzard, I packed up fast and started following the trail away from the camp. That's when I saw them in the snow. These weren't human tracks. They were too big, too long, too deep. Each footprint was maybe 18 inches long and showed what looked like claws at the ends of very long toes. But the scariest part was how far apart they were. Whatever made these tracks was taking steps at least 8 feet long. No human could do that, not even running. The tracks led up toward the highest peaks, following a route that would be dangerous even in good weather. I knew I should go back down, get help, call in the National Guard or something. But I also knew that by the time any help arrived, this storm would have covered everything. Any evidence would be gone. And maybe more importantly, I was starting to feel it too. The hunger. It started small, just a little rumble in my stomach, even though I'd eaten breakfast an hour before. But as I followed those impossible tracks higher up the mountain, the feeling got stronger. Not just hungry, but desperate. Like I hadn't eaten in days, like I was starving. I stopped and forced myself to eat some trail mix. But it didn't help. If anything, eating made the hunger worse. My mouth started watering, thinking about meat. Raw meat, fresh meat. That's when I knew this thing, whatever it was, wasn't just killing people. It was changing them. The tracks led to a place I'd never seen before, even after 19 years on these mountains. A little valley tucked between 2 peaks, completely hidden unless you knew exactly where to look. The trees here were different. Taller, darker, growing in perfect circles like they'd been planted on purpose. And in the center of the largest tree circle, I found what was left of the research team. They were arranged in a pattern around what looked like an altar made of stacked stones. All 4 of them, sitting in a perfect square, facing each other. At first I thought they were just bones, picked clean and white. But when I got closer, I could see they weren't completely dead. Not yet. Dr. Webb's eyes followed me as I approached. He couldn't speak. His throat was too damaged, but his eyes were alive and aware and full of a terrible hunger. His arms and legs were gone, chewed off clean at the joints, but somehow he was still breathing. Sarah Chen was in even worse shape. Half her face was missing, but she was trying to reach toward Tommy Rodriguez with the stumps of her arms, making little whimpering sounds like a hungry baby. They had eaten each other, piece by piece, bit by bit, but not enough to die. Just enough to feed the thing that was controlling them. The hunger hit me like a physical blow. Suddenly, I wanted nothing more than to join them in that circle, to sit down and start feeding. My mouth was full of saliva and my hands were reaching toward Dr. Webb before I even realized I was moving. That's when I heard the real voice for the first time. "Come," it said, and the words seemed to come from inside my own head. "Sit with them, feed with them. You are so hungry, Catherine Mountainheart. So very, very hungry." The voice was right. I was hungry, hungrier than I'd ever been in my life. Hungry enough to do anything, eat anything, to make the pain stop. I took a step toward the circle, then another. Dr. Webb's eyes got wide and excited. Sarah made a happy little gurgling sound. They wanted me to join them. We could all be hungry together. But something stopped me, a memory of my grandmother's voice, telling me old Cherokee stories about the winter spirits, about things that fed on human need and turned people into monsters, about how the only way to fight them was to remember who you really were. I am Catherine Mountainheart. I am the guardian of this mountain, and I will not feed. I forced myself to step backward, away from the circle. The hunger roared inside me like a living thing, demanding that I go back, that I sit down and feed and be happy forever. Instead, I reached for my grandfather's medicine bundle. The moment my fingers touched the leather pouch, the hungry voice in my head screamed. Not with words, but with pure rage and frustration. The sound was so loud, I fell to my knees, holding my ears. When I looked up, I saw it. The Wendigo stood at the edge of the tree circle, maybe 12 feet tall and thin as a skeleton. Its skin was gray-white like old ice, stretched tight over bones that stuck out at impossible angles. Its arms were too long, its legs were too long, everything about it was stretched and wrong. But the worst part was its face. It looked almost human, except for the mouth. The mouth was full of teeth, not just the front ones, but rows and rows of sharp teeth going all the way back into its throat. And its eyes were completely black, like holes in the world. It was looking right at me with those empty eyes, and I could feel its hunger like cold fingers crawling over my skin. "Mine," it said, and its voice was the sound of winter wind through dead trees. "They are mine. You will be mine." The thing started walking toward me, moving too fast and too smooth, like it was floating just above the snow. Each step it took made the hunger inside me stronger. I had maybe 30 seconds before it reached me. 30 seconds to figure out how to fight something that shouldn't exist. That's when I remembered the rest of my grandmother's stories. The ones about how the old warriors used to cleanse the mountain when the hunger spirits came. I fumbled with my grandfather's medicine bundle, trying to remember the old words, while the Wendigo glided toward me across the snow. My grandmother had made me learn them, and when I was little, said they were important for mountain guardians to know. I'd thought it was just tradition. Turns out tradition exists for good reasons. "Nvi Yelvi," I whispered, the Cherokee words feeling strange on my tongue after so many years. "Anianega Nazgi." The darkness cannot touch the pure heart. The Wendigo stopped moving. Its black eyes got wider, like it was surprised I knew the old language. That gave me enough time to really look at it, to understand what I was facing. This wasn't just some random monster. It was what happened when the hunger got so strong it took over completely. When people gave in to eating each other, they didn't just die, they became something else. Something that could never be satisfied. "You created them," I said, looking at the 4 research team members still arranged in their feeding circle. "You made them so hungry, they started eating each other. And that turned them into, what, baby versions of you?" The Wendigo's mouth opened in what might have been a smile. All those rows of teeth gleamed like ice. "Hunger calls to hunger," it said. "They fed the need. They became the need. Soon you will join them." "No," I said, standing up with the medicine bundle clutched in my hands. I won't. That's when it rushed me. The thing moved faster than anything that size should be able to move. 1 second it was 20 feet away, the next it was right in front of me, those long arms reaching for my throat. I threw myself sideways and rolled, coming up behind one of the big trees. The Wendigo slammed into the tree trunk so hard the whole mountain seemed to shake. Chunks of bark and ice flew everywhere. When it turned around to face me, I could see that its shoulder was bent at a weird angle. But it didn't seem to care about being hurt. "Mine?" it said again. "You smell of the old blood. Mountain Guardian blood. You will taste so much better than the others." It started walking toward me, again, but slower this time. Playing with me. I could feel the hunger rising up inside my chest like a living thing, making me dizzy and weak. I reached into the medicine bundle and pulled out what I was looking for. A small piece of white sage and a piece of flint my grandfather had used for ceremonies. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold them. "Maya Yelvi," I said again, louder this time. "Anionega Nazgi, Galvquodiu du Godiv." The darkness cannot touch the pure heart. The cleansing fire burns away evil. The Wendigo hissed and took a step back. "Old words," it spat. "Dead words. The Cherokee are gone from these mountains. Their protection is gone." "I'm still here," I said. "I'm Cherokee. I'm the Mountain Guardian. And you're trespassing." I struck the flint against my belt buckle, trying to get a spark. The sage was old and dry. It should catch fire easy. But my hands were shaking too much, and the Wendigo was getting closer. "Look at them," the creature said, gesturing toward the research team. "See how happy they are? No more worry, no more pain. Only the sweet satisfaction of feeding. You could be like them. You could be free of all the terrible weight of caring for others." For just a second I looked. Dr. Webb was staring at me with those hungry eyes, but there was something else there too. Something that looked almost grateful. Like maybe being turned into a feeding machine was better than being responsible for other people's lives. The hunger surged inside me again, stronger than ever. I could just sit down with them, stop fighting, stop worrying about everyone else, just to feed. The flint slipped out of my hands and fell into the snow. I was reaching toward the feeding circle when I heard my grandmother's voice, clear as if she was standing right next to me. "Catherine Mountainheart, you remember who you are. You are the guardian. You do not feed, you protect." I jerked my hand back and grabbed for the skull, flint again. This time, the spark caught. The sage burst into flame, filling the air with clean, sharp smoke. The Wendigo screamed. It wasn't just loud, it was the sound of every hungry thing that had ever existed, all crying out at once. The creature staggered backward, clawing at its face like the smoke was burning it. I stood up, holding the burning sage in front of me like a torch. "Galvquodiu du Godvi," I shouted. "Anionega ujidlsdi, neviiela usdilv, the cleansing fire burns. The pure ones stand strong. Darkness and hunger cannot touch us." The Wendigo kept backing away, but it wasn't giving up. "You cannot cleanse us all," it snarled. "Every winter, more will come. Every time people grow hungry enough, desperate enough, they will call to us. You cannot guard the mountain forever." "Maybe not forever," I said, walking toward it with the burning sage. "But I can guard it today." I threw the sage directly at the creature's face. The moment the burning plant touched the Wendigo's skin, everything changed. The thing didn't just catch fire, it dissolved, melting like old snow in the spring sun. Its scream got higher and thinner until it was just wind through the trees. In seconds, there was nothing left but a pile of gray ash and the echo of its voice saying, "We will return, when the hunger calls again." The spell over the research team broke all at once. Dr. Webb and the others collapsed into the snow, their eyes finally going empty and peaceful. They were dead now, really dead, but at least they were free. I stood there in that hidden valley, surrounded by ash and bones and the smell of burning sage, and felt the terrible hunger finally leave my body. But I also felt something else settling into its place. A new understanding, a new responsibility. The Wendigo was gone, but it wasn't destroyed, just sent away. Waiting for the next time people got desperate enough to start eating each other. Waiting for the next group of lost souls to feed the hunger that could never be satisfied. And I was the only one who knew how to stop it. The military showed up 3 days later, just like the Wendigo had predicted someone would. A whole convoy of trucks and helicopters, along with some very serious people in suits who asked a lot of questions and didn't seem to believe any of my answers. I told them the truth, mostly. Research team got lost in the blizzard, found dead from exposure and complications. I'd managed to survive using my cold weather training and Cherokee traditional knowledge. The bodies were in bad shape because of animal activity and the extreme conditions. All true, in a way. The military cordoned off that whole section of Grandfather Mountain, put up signs about avalanche danger and unstable snow conditions, made it a no-go zone for hikers and researchers. Officially, it's still closed today, 40 years later. But I go back sometimes. Not into the valley, I'm not stupid, but close enough to listen. To make sure the hunger spirits are staying quiet. Most years they do. But every once in a while, especially during the worst winters, I can feel them stirring. Whispering to people who are cold and desperate and scared. Calling them to make the choice that turns humans into monsters. I've stopped 3 more Wendigo incidents since 1974. Twice on Grandfather Mountain, once over on Mount Mitchell. Each time, I get there just before people cross the line from desperate to something else. Each time, I use my grandfather's medicine bundle and the old words my grandmother taught me. I'm 71 now, and my knees don't like climbing mountains in the snow anymore. I've been training my replacement, a young Cherokee woman named Sarah Littlewolf, who actually listens when I tell her the old stories. She's learning the words, learning the ceremonies, learning how to recognize the signs when the hunger starts calling. Because it will call. Again. Maybe not this winter, maybe not next winter, but someday. When people get hungry enough, cold enough, desperate enough, they'll start thinking thoughts that shouldn't be thought. And someone will need to be there to stop them before they become something that can never be stopped. The Blue Ridge Mountains are beautiful, peaceful, full of life and wonder. But they're also old, and they remember things that most people have forgotten. They remember what happens when humans give in to their worst hungers. And they need guardians who remember too. People ask me sometimes why I never retired, never moved somewhere warmer and easier. Why I spent my whole life watching over a bunch of rocks and trees and empty trails. The answer is simple. Because the mountains chose me. Because my grandmother's grandmother's grandmother made a promise to keep the old knowledge alive. Because someone has to stand between the hunger and the innocent people who don't know it exists. Because I am Catherine Mountainheart, guardian of the mountain's core. And some promises are more important than comfort. If you ever find yourself hiking in the Blue Ridge during a bad winter, and you start feeling hungrier than you should, hungrier than food can fix, don't ignore it. Get down off the mountain as fast as you can. Call for help. Don't let the whispers convince you that there's an easy solution to your hunger. Because once you start feeding on what you shouldn't feed on, there's no going back. Once you become the hunger, instead of just feeling it, you're not human anymore. And something tells me the next guardian might not be as lucky as I was. The old Cherokee words are dying out. The young people don't want to learn them anymore. They think the old stories are just superstition. Maybe they're right. Maybe I'm just a crazy old woman who spent too many years alone on the mountain. But when the hunger calls again, and it will call again, I hope someone remembers that some superstitions exist for very good reasons. I hope someone is listening. Asterisk. End of recorded testimony. Catherine Mountainheart, Blue Ridge Parkway Service, 2015. File sealed by order of the Department of Interior. Asterisk. My name is Samuel Greenbrier, and I've been a park ranger in the Great Smoky Mountains for 20 years. Started back in 1949, fresh out of the Army, thinking I knew everything about the wilderness. Boy, was I wrong. See, I grew up on a cattle ranch just outside Gatlinburg. My Cherokee grandmother used to tell me stories about the Iwa, what most folks call the Wampus cat, a giant cat spirit that protected sacred places in these mountains. I always figured it was just something to keep us kids from wandering too far into the deep woods. 20 years of tracking everything from black bears to mountain lions taught me different. I learned to read every print, every broken twig, every scratch on bark. Cherokee hunting traditions passed down from my grandmother, mixed with modern ranger training, made me one of the best trackers in the Park Service. I could follow a day-old trail and tell you what the animal ate for breakfast. That's why what happened at Cataract Falls in August of 1969 shook me so bad. Because everything I knew about tracking, about animals, about what was possible in these mountains, all of it fell apart in 3 terrifying days. The call came in on a Tuesday morning. August heat was already making the air thick as soup, and we'd been dealing with drought conditions for weeks. Made the animals nervous, drove them to water sources they normally avoided. "Sam, we got a situation up at Cataract Falls," Chief Ranger Henderson said, his voice crackling through the radio. "Group of campers came down this morning claiming something attacked their site. Big cat, they said. Want you to check it out." I grabbed my gear, plaster for casting prints, measuring tape, my grandfather's Cherokee tracking tools, and my .30-06 rifle, just in case. The drive up to Cataract Falls takes about an hour on the winding mountain roads, then another hour hiking through old-growth forest to reach the camping area. Cataract Falls sits in one of the most remote sections of the park, 18 miles from Gatlinburg, no roads except logging trails, and steep enough terrain to keep casual hikers away. The falls themselves drop about 60 feet into a deep pool, surrounded by massive rhododendron thickets and towering hemlocks. Cherokee considered it sacred ground, though most folks don't know that. The camping party, a family from Atlanta with 2 teenage kids, met me at the trailhead. They looked shaken, the kind of pale you get when something scares you deep. "Ranger, thank God you're here," the father said. His name was Mitchell, and his hands shook when he lit his cigarette. That thing came right through our camp. Jenny was in the tent when we heard this sound, like a woman screaming, but deeper, angrier. His daughter, maybe 16, had claw marks on her arm. Not deep, but definitely from something big. "It jumped right over our tent," she whispered. "Had to be 6 feet straight up. Nothing jumps like that." I examined the marks, 4 parallel scratches, spaced wide. Could have been a bobcat, but the spacing was all wrong. Too big, too far apart. "Did you see what it looked like?" I asked. "Sort of," Mitchell said. "Big as a mountain lion, but different." Eyes glowed yellow in our flashlight, and the way it moved, faster than anything I ever seen. I'd heard stories like this before. City folks come up to the mountains, see a black bear in the dark, and suddenly it's Bigfoot. But something about their terror felt real. Raw. The kind you can't fake. After taking their statements, I followed them back up to the campsite. The hike took us through dense forest, past streams running low from the drought. Everything felt wrong. Too quiet. In 20 years of walking these trails, I'd never heard the woods so silent. No birds singing, no squirrels chattering. Even the insects seemed hushed. When we reached the campsite, I understood why the family was so scared. The camp looked like a tornado had hit it. Tents shredded, but not randomly, deliberately. Coolers torn open and food scattered, but not eaten, just destroyed. Their metal tent poles, thick aluminum, were twisted into spirals. I'd seen bears tear up campsites before, but this was different. More violent, more purposeful. But it was the trees that made my blood run cold. All around the campsite, massive hemlock and oak trees bore claw marks. Not the usual bear scratches you see at shoulder height. These started at 8 feet and went up to 12 feet high. The gouges were 2 inches deep in solid wood, and there were 6 parallel marks instead of the usual 4 or 5. I'd been tracking large predators for 2 decades. I knew every claw pattern, every paw print, every behavioral sign of every big cat and bear in these mountains. This didn't match anything in my experience. After the family headed back to town, I set up my own camp nearby. Professional curiosity, I told myself, had to be some explanation. Maybe an escaped exotic cat from a private collector. Maybe a mutated mountain lion, though I'd never heard of such a thing. As evening fell over Cataract Falls, the silence in the woods grew heavier. I'd brought my tracking dogs, Rex and Belle, but they refused to follow any trail leading away from the destroyed campsite. Rex, who'd track a week-old deer trail through a thunderstorm, wouldn't even sniff the ground where the creature had walked. When I pulled out my compass to mark the direction of the trail, the needle spun wildly before pointing directly toward the deepest part of the forest. Then it stayed locked on that direction, no matter which way I turned. That's when I knew I was dealing with something beyond my 20 years of training. Something my grandmother's stories might have been trying to warn me about after all. I woke up at dawn to the sound of something moving through my camp. Not walking, moving. like water flowing, but with weight behind it. My eyes snapped open, and I lay perfectly still in my sleeping bag, listening. Rex and Belle, sleeping by the dying campfire, weren't making a sound. That scared me more than anything. Those dogs would bark at a falling leaf on a calm night. The movement stopped about 10 feet from my tent. I could feel something watching me. You know that feeling, when the hair on your neck stands up and your body knows it's being hunted, even if your mind hasn't caught up yet. 20 years in these mountains, and I'd never felt anything like it. I reached for my rifle, moving slower than I ever had in my life. The metal felt ice cold, even in the August heat. Outside, the silence stretched on. No birds. No insects. Even the waterfall seemed muted. Then I heard breathing. Deep, controlled, like something big trying to stay quiet. But there was something else in that breath. Intelligence. Purpose. This wasn't an animal following instinct. This was something thinking, planning. The breathing moved around my tent in a perfect circle. I tracked it by sound, my rifle following. Whatever was out there took exactly 24 steps to complete the circle. I counted each one. When it finished, the breathing stopped. I waited another hour before crawling out of my tent. The campsite looked normal. Rex and Belle were still asleep, though that was strange in itself. They usually woke up when I did. I checked around my tent for prints. Found them about 6 feet out, forming a perfect circle around where I'd slept. The prints were unlike anything I'd ever seen. Cat-like, but wrong. Too big, nearly 7 inches long and 5 inches wide. But it was the toes that made my hands shake. 6 of them. 6 distinct toe marks, each ending in a claw impression that sank an inch into the hard-packed dirt. I'd studied every track guide, every animal identification manual the Park Service had. Cats have 5 toes on their front paws, 4 on the back. Dogs have 4 on both. Nothing in North America has 6-toed paws. Nothing natural, anyway. I made plaster casts of the clearest prints, my hands moving automatically while my mind raced. The stride length was impossible, nearly 8 feet between prints. No cat could cover that much ground in a single step, not unless it was moving faster than any animal should be able to move. Following the trail led me away from Cataract Falls, deeper into the old-growth forest where tourists never went. The prints were easy to follow at first. The creature had left deep impressions in every patch of soft earth. But after about a quarter mile, something strange happened. The prints started getting lighter, shallower, like whatever made them was getting lighter as it moved. After half a mile, they disappeared completely. Not faded away. Disappeared. One moment there was a clear 6-toed print in soft creek mud. The next moment, nothing. I searched in widening circles for 2 hours. Found deer tracks, bear scat, bird scratches in the dirt. But the trail I'd been following just ended. Like whatever made those prints had stepped out of the physical world. I was crouched by the creek, staring at that last print when I heard the scream. It came from behind me, back toward my camp, a sound that made every muscle in my body lock up with fear. Not quite human, not quite animal. Like a woman's voice filtered through a predator's throat. It rose and fell in waves, echoing off the canyon walls until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Rex and Belle started howling. I'd never heard them make sounds like that, high, desperate, like they were calling for help from something they couldn't fight. I ran back through the forest, crashing through underbrush that caught at my clothes and cut my face. The scream came again, closer now, and I could hear something else underneath it. Laughter. Cold, intelligent laughter that promised terrible things. When I reached my camp, everything was wrong. My tent had been moved, not knocked over or dragged, picked up and placed 15 feet to the left, perfectly level, still staked down. My gear was arranged in a neat circle around the dead campfire. Not scattered or destroyed, arranged. Like someone had been organizing my belongings while I was gone. Rex and Belle were sitting at the edge of camp, perfectly still, staring into the forest. Their ears were flat against their heads, and they were shaking. When I called their names, they didn't respond, just kept staring into the trees like they were seeing something I couldn't. I followed their gaze and saw them. Eyes, yellow eyes, watching from the shadows about 30 feet away. Too high off the ground to belong to any normal animal, maybe 10 feet up, which meant whatever they belonged to was either very tall or sitting in a tree. But there was no tree where those eyes were floating. I raised my rifle, and the eyes blinked once, slow, deliberate, like whoever was behind them was amused by my weapon. Then they moved. Not side to side like an animal turning its head. They moved straight up, higher into the canopy, until they disappeared among the leaves. But I could still feel them watching. Still feel that cold intelligence studying me like I was some interesting bug. That's when I started to understand what my grandmother had been trying to tell me all those years ago. The Wampus Cat wasn't just a story to scare children. It was a warning about things that lived in these mountains long before the first settlers arrived. Things that protected places humans weren't supposed to go. And I had the sinking feeling I'd stumbled into the middle of territory that very much did not want me there. The eyes stayed with me as I packed up my camp. I could feel them tracking my every movement, calculating, planning. When I finally hiked back toward the ranger station, they followed. Always just at the edge of vision, always watching. It wasn't until I reached the main trail that the feeling of being hunted finally faded. But I knew it wasn't over. I'd seen something that wasn't supposed to exist, and it had seen me back. Whatever lived in the deep woods around Cataract Falls was deciding what to do about that. I just hoped I'd get a say in the matter. 3 days later, the killing started. I was in the ranger station filling out my incident report when the call came in. 2 hikers found dead near Cataract Falls, their bodies arranged in a way that made the county sheriff throw up twice before he could finish examining the scene. "Sam, I need you up there," Sheriff Morrison said over the radio. His voice shook. "This ain't like anything I ever seen. Bring your tracking gear, and maybe some of them Cherokee contacts you got. Think we might need 'em." The drive back to Cataract Falls felt different this time. Longer. Like the mountain itself was trying to keep me away. My radio crackled with static, and my truck's engine kept missing, though I'd just had it serviced. By the time I reached the trailhead, storm clouds were gathering, even though the weather report called for clear skies. Sheriff Morrison met me at the trail entrance with 3 of his deputies. All of them looked pale, shaken. Morrison had been law enforcement in these mountains for 15 years, seen bear attacks, hunting accidents, even a few murders. Nothing rattled him. Today, his hands shook when he lit his cigarette. "Bodies are about a mile in," he said. 2 college kids from Knoxville. Came up here for some nature photography. What we found." He took a long drag. "Sam, I've seen what bears do to people. I've seen what mountain lions do. This ain't that." The hike-in was quiet except for our footsteps. No birds, no insects. Even the wind seemed muted. My skin kept crawling, like invisible eyes were tracking our movement. Twice I spun around, certain something was following us. Found nothing but empty trail. When we reached the scene, I understood why Morrison looked so shaken. The 2 victims, a boy and girl, maybe 20 years old, had been killed near the base of the waterfall. But they hadn't just been killed, they'd been positioned, arranged. The boy sat with his back against a massive oak tree, arms spread wide, head tilted back. The girl knelt beside him, one hand on his shoulder, facing the forest. Like they were presenting themselves to something in the woods, like they were paying respect to something they'd disturbed. Both bodies bore the same claw marks I'd seen on the camping family's daughter. But these were deep, fatal. 4 parallel gashes across the throat, spaced too wide for any known predator. The wounds were clean, precise, not the random slashing you'd see in an animal attack. This was execution. "Look at their faces," Morrison whispered. I looked, then wished I hadn't. Both victims' eyes were wide open, but not with fear. With recognition. Like in their final moments, they'd seen something that answered a question they'd been carrying their whole lives. Around the bodies, the ground was covered with 6-toed prints. Hundreds of them, forming intricate patterns that looked almost like writing. Like something had been circling the victims for hours, leaving a message in a language none of us could read. "There's something else," Morrison said. He led me to a pile of rocks about 10 feet from the bodies. Found this arranged on top of them. The objects were clearly Cherokee artifacts. Pottery shards, arrowheads, what looked like pieces of a ceremonial pipe. Old pieces, the kind that belonged in museums, not scattered around a crime scene. Kids were artifact hunters, one of the deputies said. Found camping gear full of this stuff. Looks like they'd been digging up Indian burial sites. That's when I started to understand. The bee. Wampus Cat wasn't just hunting, it was protecting. These kids had violated sacred Cherokee burial grounds, and something very old and very angry had decided to teach them respect the hard way. I spent the next hour tracking around the scene while the coroner worked. The prince told a story that made my blood run cold. Whatever killed these kids had stalked them for hours before making its move. The trail showed it had followed them from at least 3 different burial sites scattered throughout the forest. It knew exactly what they'd been doing, and it had planned their punishment accordingly. "Sam," Morrison called, "you need to see this." He was standing by a tree about 20 yards from the bodies. The trunk was carved with symbols I recognized from my grandmother's stories. Cherokee protection markers, warnings to stay away from sacred ground. But these weren't old carvings weathered by time. These were fresh, cut deep into the bark sometime in the last few days. "Think your grandmother's stories got any advice for dealing with something like this?" Morrison asked. Before I could answer, we heard it. That same scream I'd heard at my camp, but closer, louder. It echoed off the canyon walls and seemed to come from everywhere at once. The deputies reached for their weapons, but I grabbed Morrison's arm. "Don't," I said. "Guns won't help with this." "What do you mean guns won't?" The scream came again, and this time I saw the source. High in the canopy, moving through the treetops like it weighed nothing, was a shape that shouldn't exist. Cat-like but wrong, bigger than any mountain lion, with yellow eyes that glowed even in daylight. It moved from tree to tree, without jumping, just flowing through the branches like liquid shadow. "Jesus Christ," one of the deputies whispered. "What is that thing?" It stopped directly above us, about 40 feet up in an oak tree that couldn't possibly support the weight of something that large. For a long moment, it just watched us. I could feel its intelligence, its anger, its absolute confidence that we were trespassing in its domain. Then it spoke. Not words exactly, but a sound that felt like communication. Low, rumbling, with an undertone that bypassed my ears and went straight to my bones. It was explaining something, but in a language older than human speech. The message was clear anyway. "Get out. Now. And don't come back. We need to leave," I said. "Right now. Sam, we got a crime scene to process." "Sheriff, I've been tracking animals in these mountains for 20 years. That's not an animal. That's something else entirely. And it's telling us to leave its territory before it decides we're as guilty as those kids were." Morrison looked up at the creature in the trees. It hadn't moved, hadn't made another sound, but its presence pressed down on us like a physical weight, making it hard to breathe, hard to think clearly. "Pack it up," he told his deputies. "We'll come back with more men." As we gathered our gear and started back down the trail, I could feel the creature following us. Always just out of sight, always watching. The pressure didn't ease until we reached the main trail, and even then I felt like we were being escorted out rather than leaving on our own. When we reached our vehicles, Morrison grabbed my arm. "Sam, what are we dealing with here? Really?" I thought about my grandmother's stories, about Cherokee warnings that had been passed down for generations, about guardian spirits that protected sacred places from those who would disturb them. "Something that's been in these mountains a lot longer than we have," I said. "Something that takes protecting Cherokee burial grounds very seriously. Can it be stopped?" I looked back toward the forest, toward Cataract Falls and the deep woods where something ancient and angry was making sure the dead stayed properly honored. "Sheriff, I don't think stopping it is the point. I think learning to respect what it's protecting might be our only option." That night, alone in my cabin, I called my grandmother's sister in Cherokee, told her what I'd seen, what I thought we were dealing with. She listened in silence, then spoke in Cherokee for several minutes. When she switched back to English, her voice was grim. "Samuel, the Iwa has awakened. Someone has disturbed too many sacred places, taken too many sacred objects. It will not rest until the balance is restored." How do we restore the balance? The artifacts must be returned to where they belong, and the one who took them must make proper amends. If they cannot, the Iwa will continue to hunt until justice is done. I thought about the 2 dead college students, positioned like they were paying eternal respect to the sacred ground they'd violated. And if more people keep disturbing burial sites? My great-aunt was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of centuries. "Then there will be more lessons taught. The Iwa is patient, Samuel. It has waited in the deep places for many years, but its patience is not limitless. After I hung up, I sat on my porch looking toward the mountains where something ancient was stirring. In the distance, I could hear sounds that had no business in the modern world. Calls and cries that spoke of older laws, older justice. The Wampus cat was hunting, and until the sacred places were properly respected again, it wouldn't stop. I just hoped I could figure out how to appease it before it decided that all humans were equally guilty of disturbing what should be left alone. The third attack came 5 days later, and this time it was personal. I was leading a search party looking for Dr. James Fletcher, an archaeologist from the University of Tennessee who'd gone missing near Cataract Falls. His research team said he'd been obsessed with finding what he called the Mother Lode, a major Cherokee burial site that supposedly contained artifacts worth millions to private collectors. The kind of man who saw sacred ground as a business opportunity. We found his camp first. Destroyed like the others, but with a difference. This time, the creature had left a message that even I could understand. Every piece of Fletcher's excavation equipment had been gathered into a pile and systematically destroyed. Shovels bent into pretzels, metal detectors crushed flat, electronic gear smashed beyond recognition, but his notebooks were untouched, spread open around the pile like someone had been reading them. "Sam," called Deputy Richards from across the clearing. "You need to see this." Fletcher's body was arranged at the base of a massive oak tree, positioned in a sitting meditation pose facing the forest. His hands were folded in his lap, holding something. When I got closer, I saw what it was. Every Cherokee artifact he'd stolen. Pottery, arrowheads, pieces of ceremonial tools, all of it carefully placed in his arms like he was making an offering. And around the tree, carved deep into the bark, were fresh Cherokee symbols. My great-aunt had taught me enough to recognize some of them. Warning, judgment, balance restored. "Jesus, what kind of animal does this?" Richards asked. "It's not an animal," I said, studying the scene. "It's a guardian, and it's trying to teach us something." That's when I heard my name being called. Not from the search party, from the forest. A voice that sounded like wind through old trees, like water running over ancient stones. Speaking English, but with an accent older than the mountains themselves. "Samuel Greenbrier, come alone." The other men heard it too. I could see the fear in their faces, the way their hands moved toward their weapons. But I knew guns wouldn't help here. This was about more than self-defense. "Stay here," I told. "Don't follow me, no matter what you hear." I walked into the forest following the voice, my grandmother's Cherokee prayer beads in my pocket and her words in my memory. The trees closed around me, and the normal sounds of the forest faded to nothing. Even my footsteps seemed muted, like the earth itself was holding its breath. The voice led me deeper into the woods, to a place I'd never seen before despite 20 years of hiking these trails. A circular clearing surrounded by the largest trees I'd ever seen in the Smokies. Ancient oaks and hemlocks that must have been growing when the Cherokee first came to these mountains. In the center of the clearing was a pile of stones arranged in a perfect spiral. Cherokee burial markers, older than anything I'd seen in museums. This was the sacred site Fletcher had been looking for. The Mother Lode. And sitting beside it, no longer trying to hide, was the Wampus cat. It was bigger than I'd imagined. 8 feet long from nose to tail, with muscles that moved like liquid under tawny fur, marked with patterns that seemed to shift in the dappled sunlight. 6-toed paws the size of dinner plates, each claw as long as my finger, but it was the eyes that held me frozen in place. Yellow eyes filled with intelligence older than human civilization. Eyes that had watched the Cherokee build their first settlements, had seen the first European explorers, had witnessed the Trail of Tears and the centuries of desecration that followed. Eyes that judged me and found me. Interesting. When it spoke, the voice came from everywhere and nowhere, vibrating through my bones rather than my ears. "Samuel Greenbrier, grandson of Ayanna Greenbrier, who knew the old ways. You carry her blood, her respect for sacred things." I couldn't speak, could barely breathe. The presence of this creature pressed against my mind like a physical weight, ancient and vast and utterly alien to human understanding. Your people. They have forgotten the laws. They dig up the bones of my charges, scatter sacred objects like trinkets. They turn burial grounds into shopping opportunities. The Wampus cat rose to its feet, and I realized it was even larger than I'd thought. When it stood, its head was level with mine, and I could see the intelligence burning behind those impossible eyes. I have been patient. I have given warnings. But patience has limits, even for guardians. What do you want? I managed to whisper. Justice, balance, respect for what your ancestors promised to honor. It moved closer, and I could feel the heat radiating from its body, smell the scent of deep forest and ancient earth. The stolen artifacts must be returned. The disturbed graves must be restored. And someone must ensure it never happens again. How? I'm just a park ranger. I can't control what people do. The creature's eyes seemed to look right through me, seeing something I couldn't understand. You carry the old blood. You know the sacred places. You could become what Fletcher and his kind feared most. What's that? A guardian, like me. The words hit me like a physical blow. You want me to. Protect what remains. Watch over the sacred sites. Ensure the balance is maintained. The wampus cat moved around me in a slow circle, and I could feel its power washing over me like a tide. Those who disturb sacred ground would learn to fear you as they have learned to fear me. And if I refuse, then I continue my work alone. But your people multiply, and their greed grows stronger. Eventually, I will be forced to protect these mountains by methods your kind would find unpleasant. I thought about Fletcher, about the 2 college students, about all the amateur archaeologists and treasure hunters who saw Cherokee burial sites as opportunities rather than sacred ground. What would I have to do? Accept the mark. Become something more than human. In return, you would know when sacred sites are being disturbed. You would have the power to stop those who would desecrate them. And you would live long enough to ensure the old laws are remembered. The choice seemed impossible. Remain human and watch as more sacred sites were destroyed, more artifacts stolen, more ancient burials scattered to the winds. Or accept transformation into something like the creature before me, become a guardian myself. The mark comes with a price, the wampus cat said, reading my thoughts. You would no longer be fully human. Your life would be bound to these mountains, to the sacred sites you protect. And you would be alone, as I have been alone, for as long as the mountains stand. I thought about my grandmother, about the stories she'd told me of Cherokee guardians who protected sacred places, about the responsibility that came with understanding the old ways. If I accept, what happens to you? I return to the deep places, to sleep until I am needed again. The burden would pass to you, as it passed to me from another long ago. I closed my eyes and felt the weight of decision pressing down on me. When I opened them again, the wampus cat was watching me with something that might have been sympathy. Choose, Samuel Greenbrier. But choose knowing that once given, the mark cannot be undone. I thought about Fletcher's body, arranged in eternal respect for the graves he'd violated. About the 2 college students, positioned like they were offering apology to the ancestors they'd disturbed. About all the sacred sites that had been lost, because no one was there to protect them. I accept, I said. The wampus cat nodded once, then placed one massive paw on my chest. Pain shot through me like lightning, and I felt something fundamental change in my body, my mind, my very soul. The world suddenly became bigger, more complex. I could sense every living thing in the forest, could feel the pulse of the earth itself beneath my feet. And I could feel the sacred sites scattered throughout the mountains, some protected, some violated, all of them calling to something deep inside me that hadn't existed moments before. When the transformation finished, I was still human. But I was also something more, something with the power to protect what needed protecting, to ensure that the ancestors would rest undisturbed. The wampus cat stepped back, and I could see approval in its ancient eyes. It is done. The burden passes. Guard them well, Samuel Greenbrier. Then it turned and walked into the forest, fading like mist until only the memory of yellow eyes remained. I stood alone in the sacred clearing, feeling power coursing through my veins and responsibility settling on my shoulders like a heavy cloak. In the distance, I could hear the search party calling my name. Time to go back to the world of humans. Time to begin my new work as a guardian. I returned to the search party 3 hours later, though it felt like days had passed in that sacred clearing. The other men were relieved to see me, but I could tell they sensed something different. The way they looked at me spoke to me. like they were talking to a stranger wearing Sam Greenbrier's face. They weren't wrong. "Find anything out there?" Deputy Richards asked. "Just more forest," I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I could feel the lie burning in my throat. Everything was different now. I could sense things I'd never noticed before. The way the trees whispered warnings about intruders, the way the earth itself mourned over disturbed graves, the way sacred sites called out like beacons in my mind. We processed Fletcher's death as another animal attack. Officially, that's what it was. A large predator of unknown species, possibly an escaped exotic cat, was responsible for 3 deaths in the Cataract Falls area. The Park Service quietly closed several trails and relocated camping areas away from what I now knew were Cherokee burial sites. No one questioned my recommendations about which areas to avoid. They couldn't have explained why, but they trusted my judgment in ways they never had before. Over the following weeks, I began to understand what my transformation meant. I could sense when someone was disturbing sacred ground from miles away, felt it like a physical pain in my chest. I could move through the forest faster than any human should be able to, track without leaving prints of my own, and see in darkness as clearly as daylight. Most importantly, I could project fear. Real, primal terror that sent would-be grave robbers running before they could do serious damage to sacred sites. The first test came in September. A group of amateur archaeologists from Atlanta arrived with metal detectors and shovels, having read about Fletcher's research online. They set up camp near an old Cherokee burial ground and started digging that very night. I felt them the moment their first shovel bit into sacred earth. By the time I reached their campsite, moving silently through forest that parted before me like water, they'd already unearthed several artifacts. Pottery shards, arrowheads, what looked like pieces of a ceremonial mask. I didn't announce myself. Didn't need to. I simply stood at the edge of their camp and let them feel my presence. Let them sense the anger radiating from something that was no longer entirely human. The first man to see me dropped his flashlight and ran. The others followed within seconds, abandoning their equipment and stolen artifacts in their panic to escape something their minds couldn't process. I spent the rest of the night carefully reburying everything they'd disturbed, whispering Cherokee prayers my grandmother had taught me. When the sun rose, the burial site looked undisturbed again, and the terrified grave robbers were probably halfway back to Atlanta. Word spread quickly through the prey, underground artifact hunting community. Something was protecting Cherokee sites in the Smokies, something that made grown men abandon expensive equipment and run screaming into the night. The stories grew with each telling, as stories do, until most treasure hunters considered the entire Cataract Falls area cursed, which was exactly what I wanted. My official work as a park ranger continued, but now it had deeper purpose. I submitted reports recommending protection for dozens of sites I could sense but had never seen. When developers tried to build near sacred ground, I found ways to complicate their permits. When tourists strayed too close to burial sites, I guided them away with suggestions that felt perfectly natural to them. The Wampus cat had been right about the loneliness. As months passed, I found it harder to relate to other humans. Their concerns seemed small, temporary. Their lives flashed by like mayflies while I felt the weight of centuries pressing down on my shoulders. But I also felt the peace that came from sacred sites remaining undisturbed. The gratitude of ancestors who could finally rest without fear of desecration. The balance between past and present slowly being restored. On quiet nights, when I walked the moonlit trails that had become my true home, I sometimes caught glimpses of yellow eyes watching from the deep forest. The Wampus cat, checking on its successor, making sure the burden was being carried properly. It never spoke to me again, didn't need to. We both understood what we were protecting, what we'd sacrificed to keep it safe. In my final report as Chief Ranger Henderson, I wrote, "The predator situation at Cataract Falls appears to have resolved itself. No further incidents reported, and amateur archaeology activity in the area has ceased entirely. Recommend continued protection of the designated sites and regular patrols of sensitive areas." What I didn't write was the truth, that something older than the human civilization was watching over these mountains, ensuring that the sacred stayed sacred and the dead remained at peace. I retired from official ranger duties on my 20th anniversary, though everyone knew I'd never really leave the mountains. My replacement, a young man fresh from forestry school, asked me for advice on his first day. Just remember, I told him, these mountains have been here a lot longer than we have. Sometimes the best way to protect them is to make sure people respect what they don't understand. He nodded like he knew what I meant, though he couldn't have. Not yet. Now I live in a cabin at the edge of the deep woods, officially a hermit, unofficially the guardian of sacred sites throughout the Great Smoky Mountains. Artifact hunters still come sometimes, drawn by stories of Cherokee treasures hidden in ancient burial grounds. They never find what they're looking for. Usually, they don't stay long enough to try, because word has spread through certain circles about the thing that protects Cherokee sites in these mountains. Something that moves like shadow and watches with eyes that burn yellow in the darkness. Something that judges those who would disturb sacred ground and finds most of them wanting. The Cherokee called it Iwa, the wampus cat. But the old guardian sleeps now in the deep places, and a new protector walks the moonlit trails. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the mist rises from Cataract Falls and the forest holds its breath, you might catch a glimpse of me moving through the trees. Might feel the weight of ancient eyes measuring your intentions, your respect for things beyond human understanding. If you're just a hiker enjoying the mountains, you'll feel nothing but the peace of the deep woods. But if you've come looking for Cherokee artifacts, planning to dig up sacred ground for profit, well, you'd better hope you never meet the thing that's taken over protecting these mountains. Because unlike the old guardian, I still remember what it was like to be human, and that makes me far less patient with those who forget what respect means. The sacred sites sleep peacefully now, watched over by something that understands both the old ways and the new threats. And in the deepest parts of the forest, where the trees grow thick and the shadows hold secrets older than memory, the true guardians of these mountains continue their eternal watch. Some treasures are worth more than money. Some places demand more than curiosity. And some guardians never rest. My name is Nathan Wolfhart, and I've been a park ranger in Jefferson National Forest for 18 years now. Started back in 1954, fresh out of Korea, looking for some peace in these Virginia mountains where I was born and raised. Never thought I'd be telling this story, but after what happened on Devil's Backbone Ridge in October of '72, I figure folks have a right to know. See, I'm what you'd call a practical man. Spent 4 years dodging bullets in Korea, then came home to work search and rescue in some of the toughest terrain on the East Coast. I've pulled more than 200 people out of these mountains. Hikers who got lost, climbers who took a bad fall, spelunkers who got themselves turned around in the cave systems. I know every trail, every rock face, every cave entrance from here to the Tennessee border. My granny used to tell stories about Devil's Backbone when I was little. Old Cherokee tales about something called Kitawa, a horned serpent that lived deep in the earth, guarding sacred places. She'd rock on the porch and spin yarns about how the creature would rise up if anyone disturbed the old places, the holy spots where the Cherokee used to pray and bury their dead. That ridge ain't called Devil's Backbone for nothing, Nathan, she'd say, pointing her gnarled finger toward the jagged limestone outcropping that cut across the sky like a broken spine. Cherokee knew better than to build there. White folks should learn the same lesson. I always figured it was just mountain superstition. Hell, I'd been up and down that ridge more times than I could count. The limestone formations make for tricky climbing, sure, and the cave systems run deep, some we still haven't mapped all the way through. But devils and serpents? That was just old-timey folks trying to explain things they didn't understand. Until October 23rd, 1972. That morning started like any other. Coffee at 5 a.m., weather report on the radio, checking my gear. The forecast called for fog rolling in by afternoon, maybe some early snow up high. Perfect weather for city folks to get themselves lost. I was loading my pack when the call came through on the radio. Missing persons report. 4 geology students from Virginia Tech who'd gone up to study the cave formations 3 days prior. Their professor expected them back Monday night. When they didn't show, he drove up to their campsite Tuesday morning and found their tents still set up, but no sign of the kids. Equipment's all there too, Sheriff Morrison told me over the crackling radio. Sleeping bags, cooking gear, even their wallets, like they just vanished into thin air. I'd handled hundreds of these cases. Sometimes people fall, sometimes they get lost and panic. Sometimes they just decide to keep hiking and forget to tell anyone. But leaving their wallets? That was strange. "I'll head up there this morning," I radioed back. "Probably holed up in one of the caves waiting out the weather." The drive up to Devil's Backbone takes about an hour on the old logging roads. The higher you get, the more the trees thin out, until you're looking at nothing but jagged limestone and scrub brush. The spine of the ridge runs for maybe 2 miles, broken by deep crevices and cave openings that drop down into the mountain's belly. Their campsite was exactly like the sheriff described. 4 tents in a neat line, cook stove still out, climbing ropes coiled and ready. I walked the perimeter, looking for tracks, broken branches, anything that might tell me which way they'd gone. That's when I found the first strange thing. Their gear was arranged in perfect circles. Not just dropped or scattered like you'd expect if they'd left in a hurry. The climbing hardware, helmets, pitons, carabiners, helmets, all laid out in 3 separate circles about 10 feet apart. Each circle was maybe 6 feet across, with the equipment spaced evenly around the edges. I stood there, scratching my head. Bears will scatter gear looking for food, but they don't arrange it in geometric patterns. Maybe the wind? But the equipment was too heavy, and besides, there wasn't enough wind up here to move a carabiner, let alone arrange it in circles. I took pictures with my Polaroid and made notes in my logbook. Then I started checking the cave entrances. Devil's Backbone has 17 mapped cave openings, ranging from little cracks you'd have to squeeze through sideways to cathedral-sized chambers that could hold a school bus. The geology students would have been most interested in the bigger caves, better formations, and easier access for their equipment. I started with Serpent's Mouth, the largest cave opening on the south face. The entrance is maybe 20 feet wide and twice as tall, carved out of the limestone by thousands of years of water flow. I'd been in there dozens of times for rescues and training exercises, but as I approached the entrance, something felt wrong. The silence hit me first. These mountains are never quiet, there's always something. Birds calling, squirrels chattering, wind through the trees, insects buzzing. But walking towards Serpent's Mouth, I couldn't hear anything except my own footsteps crunching on fallen leaves. Then I noticed my compass acting up. The needle kept swinging around like it couldn't decide which way was north. I tapped the case, thinking maybe I'd banged it against something, but the needle just kept spinning. I stopped about 50 feet from the cave entrance and called out, "Hello, anybody in there? This is Park Ranger Wolfhart." My voice echoed back from inside the cave, but there was something odd about the echo. It seemed to go on too long, like the sound was bouncing around chambers much deeper than I knew existed. And then I smelled it. Sulfur. Like rotten eggs mixed with something else, something hot and metallic. I'd smelled sulfur before in some of the deeper caves, usually from mineral deposits or underground springs. But this was stronger, and it seemed to be drifting out of the cave mouth like breath. I clicked on my flashlight and moved closer to the entrance. The smell got stronger with each step. By the time I reached the cave mouth, my eyes were watering. That's when I saw the claw marks. They were gouged into the limestone walls on either side of the cave entrance, starting about 8 feet up and running down to chest height. 4 parallel grooves, each one about an inch deep and as wide as my thumb. The limestone around the marks looked melted somehow, like whatever made them had been hot enough to soften the rock. I'd seen bear claws marks before. Hell, I'd seen mountain lion scratches. But bears can't reach 8 feet up a vertical wall, and no animal I knew of could melt limestone. I stood there staring at those marks, feeling that first cold touch of real fear creep up my spine. For the first time in 18 years of ranging these mountains, I was looking at something I couldn't explain. Something that made my granny's old stories start feeling a lot less like superstition. I radioed back to headquarters for backup. Standard procedure when things start looking unusual. Never go into an unknown situation alone. Jenkins was working the north sector that day, and he could be at my location within an hour. While I waited, I decided to check the other cave entrances. Maybe the claw marks were just some freak geological thing, the Stellmine of K. Limestone can do strange stuff when water and minerals get involved. And the sulfur smell could be from a new hot spring. I'd seen weirder things in 18 years of mountain work. But every cave entrance I checked told the same story. Claw marks, sulfur smell, and that unnatural silence that made the hair on my neck stand up. By the time I reached the 4th cave, I noticed something else. The ground around each entrance felt warm, not sun-warmed. It was October in the mountains, maybe 40 degrees, and the sun was hidden behind thick clouds. But the limestone around these cave mouths was warm to the touch, like something inside was radiating heat upward through the rock. Jenkins arrived just after noon, bouncing up the logging road in his patrol truck with his 2 search dogs, Rex and Sadie. I'd worked with Jenkins for 6 years, and he was Eddie. He was solid, experienced, not the type to spook easy. If anyone could help me make sense of this situation, it was him. "What have we got, Nathan?" he asked, letting the dogs out of the truck. They immediately started sniffing around the campsite, tails wagging, ready to work. I filled him in on what I'd found: the arranged equipment, the claw marks, the warm ground. He listened without commenting, just nodding and taking notes. That's what I liked about Jenkins. He didn't judge or dismiss, he just gathered information. "Let's see these claw marks," he said. We walked over to Serpent's Mouth together. The dogs started to follow, then stopped about halfway there. Their tails went down, ears back, and they started whining. Rex, a big German shepherd who'd never shown fear of anything, actually started backing away. "Come on, boys," Jenkins called. "Nothing to be scared of." But the dogs wouldn't budge. Sadie, normally the bolder of the two, was trembling. They'd track a wounded bear into a blizzard without hesitation, but they wouldn't go near that cave entrance. "That's unusual," Jenkins said, frowning. We left the dogs back at the truck and approached the cave on foot. I watched Jenkins's face as he saw the claw marks for the first time. His expression went from curious to confused to worried in about 3 seconds. "What the hell made these?" he muttered, running his fingers along one of the grooves. "I was hoping you could tell me." He pulled out his measuring tape and documented the marks, 8.5 feet from the ground to the top of the highest groove. 4 parallel scratches, each one 14 inches long. The spacing between them suggested something with claws the size of railroad spikes. "Bears can't reach this high," he said. "And even if they could, their claws aren't big enough to make marks like this." That's what I figured. Jenkins stepped closer to the cave entrance and immediately started coughing. "Jesus, what's that smell?" "Sulfur. Gets stronger the closer you get to the opening." We both clicked on our flashlights and peered into the cave. The main chamber stretched back about 50 feet before splitting into multiple passages. Our lights showed the usual limestone formations: BOK, stalactites, flowstone, the occasional bat sleeping on the ceiling. Nothing unusual, except for the temperature. "You feel that?" Jenkins asked. I nodded. The air coming out of the cave was warm, maybe 70 degrees. In October, most caves would be cooling down, matching the outside temperature. This felt like a summer day. "Must be a thermal spring down there somewhere," I said. But even as I said it, I didn't believe it. I'd been in caves with hot springs before. This felt different. The air wasn't humid like it would be near water. It was dry and hot, like standing near a furnace. We were about to enter the cave when we heard it, a rumbling sound from deep underground. Not the rumble of water or falling rocks. This sounded organic. Like breathing. Like something huge taking a slow, deep breath and letting it out. Jenkins and I looked at each other. The sound lasted maybe 10 seconds, then stopped. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, like the mountain itself was holding its breath. "Could be a rockfall settling," Jenkins said, but his voice had gone quiet. "Could be." We waited another minute, listening, but the sound didn't repeat. Finally, Jenkins stepped into the cave entrance. I followed right behind him, both our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The main chamber looked normal enough. Limestone walls carved smooth by centuries of water flow, a sandy floor scattered with the usual cave debris. Our footsteps echoed in the silence as we made our way toward the back of the chamber where the passages split off. That's when Jenkins stopped suddenly. "Nathan, look at this." He was pointing his light at the far wall of the chamber. At first, I didn't see what had caught his attention. Then I noticed the paintings. They were carved and painted on the limestone in reds and blacks, primitive figures that looked old, really old. Cherokee work, most likely, though I'd never seen cave paintings this deep in Jefferson National Forest. The images showed human figures, animals, and in the center, something else, a serpent. But not like any snake I'd ever seen. This thing had a massive body that coiled around itself in spiral patterns, with a head that looked more like a bull's than a snake's. Two curved horns projected from its skull, and its eyes were painted with some kind of mineral that caught our flashlight beams and reflected them back like mirrors. "Cherokee pictographs," Jenkins whispered. "These are probably hundreds of years old." I studied the painting more closely. The human figures around the serpent were clearly meant to be offerings or worshippers, kneeling with their arms raised. But there was something about their postures that suggested fear more than reverence. And the serpent's body seemed to disappear into the rock itself, like it was emerging from or descending into the earth. "Kitawa," I said without thinking. "What?" "Nothing. Just something my grandmother used to talk about." That's when I noticed my compass again. I pulled it out and watched the needle spin wildly, unable to find magnetic north. But more than that, no matter which direction I faced, the needle seemed to point toward the back of the cave, toward the passages that led deeper into the mountain. "Jenkins," I said, "check your compass." He pulled his out and frowned. Same thing. The needle pointed steadily toward the back of the cave, like there was some kind of magnetic anomaly down in the deeper passages. We were still staring at our compasses when the rumbling started again. This time it was louder, closer. The sound seemed to come from all around us, vibrating through the limestone under our feet. I felt it in my chest, in my bones. It lasted longer this time, maybe 20 seconds, and when it stopped, tiny pebbles continued to rain down from the ceiling. "We should get out of here," Jenkins said. I was about to agree when we heard something else. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from one of the passages at the back of the chamber. We both froze, listening. The footsteps were definitely human. Numb. The rhythm was wrong for any animal. But they sounded strange, like someone walking in thick mud or sand. "Hello?" I called out. "Is someone there? We're park rangers." The footsteps stopped. We waited, barely breathing, our flashlight beams fixed on the passage where the sound had come from. Then, very slowly, a figure stepped into the edge of our light. It was one of the geology students. A young woman, maybe 20 years old, wearing khaki pants and a Virginia Tech sweatshirt. She moved awkwardly, like she was having trouble walking, and she didn't respond to our lights or voices. "Miss, are you all right?" Jenkins called out. She took another step forward, and that's when I saw her face. Her eyes were open, but they weren't seeing anything. They had a glassy, vacant look, like she was sleepwalking, and her skin had a strange, grayish color that didn't look right in our flashlight beams. "Miss, we're here to help you," I said, taking a step toward her. She opened her mouth like she was trying to speak, but instead of words, a sound came out that made my blood freeze. A low, rumbling growl that sounded nothing like human vocal cords could produce. The sound echoed off the cave walls and seemed to go on forever. Then she collapsed. Jenkins and I rushed forward, but when we reached the spot where she'd been standing, there was nothing there. No body, no sign that anyone had been there at all. Just smooth sand and limestone. We searched the passage with our flashlights, calling out, but found nothing. It was like she'd vanished into the rock itself. "What the hell was that?" Jenkins whispered. I didn't have an answer, but as we stood there in the darkness, I could feel something watching us from deeper in the cave. Something that had been waiting a long time for visitors. Something that had learned to use their faces. We got out of that cave faster than I'd ever moved in my life. Jenkins was right behind me, both of us stumbling over rocks in our hurry to reach daylight. When we burst out of Serpent's Mouth, the dogs started barking and wouldn't stop until we were halfway back to the trucks. "Did that really happen?" Jenkins asked, still breathing hard. I nodded, though part of me wanted to believe it was some kind of hallucination. Caves can mess with your mind sometimes. Bad air, darkness, echoes that sound like voices. But we'd both seen the same thing, and the dog's reaction told me our senses weren't playing tricks. "We need to call this in," I said. "Get a full search team up here." But when Jenkins tried the radio, all we got was static. Same with the truck radio, and even the emergency beacon. It was like something was jamming all our communications. "Equipment failure?" Jenkins suggested. "All of it at once?" We were standing there trying to figure out our next move when we heard voices coming from the direction of another cave opening, Devil's Throat, about a quarter mile south along the ridge. Young voices, laughing and talking like they didn't have a care in the world. "More hikers," Jenkins said. "We need to warn them off." We grabbed our gear and headed toward the sounds. Devil's Throat is one of the smaller cave entrances, just big enough for a person to squeeze through if they're determined. Not the kind of place experienced cavers would usually bother with, but college kids will try anything. As we got closer, I could make out distinct voices. 2 males, 1 female. They sounded happy, excited, like they were having the adventure of their lives. "Hello," I called out when we were about 50 yards away. "Park Service, we need to talk to you." The voices stopped immediately. We reached Devil's Throat and found fresh footprints in the soft earth around the entrance, along with some gear, water bottles, a coil of rope, and a backpack with Brad Morrison written on the name tag in black marker. "They went inside," Jenkins said, studying the tracks. I knelt down and put my hand near the cave entrance. Same thing as before. Warm air, sulfur smell, and that feeling like something was watching from just beyond the reach of daylight. "We can't leave them in there," I said. Jenkins nodded, though I could tell he didn't like the idea any more than I did. Devil's Throat starts narrow. You have to crawl for the first 20 feet, then opens up into a chamber about the size of a living room. From there, it connects to the main cave system through a series of tight passages that eventually link up with Serpent's Mouth and the other larger caves. We squeezed through the entrance passage and emerged into the main chamber. Our flashlight beams swept across limestone walls and sandy floor, looking for any sign of the 3 people we'd heard. "Hey," Jenkins shouted. "Is anybody in here? We're park rangers." His voice echoed through the chamber and down the connecting passages. We waited, listening, but got no response. That's when I noticed the footprints. They led across the sandy floor toward one of the back passages, but they looked wrong. The prints started out normal. Boot treads, tennis shoe patterns, the kind of marks you'd expect from 3 college students. But as they progressed across the chamber, they seemed to change. The stride length got longer. The prints got deeper, like whoever was making them was getting heavier with each step. And near the passage entrance, the prints didn't look human anymore. They looked like claws. "Jenkins, look at this." He came over and studied the tracks with his flashlight. I watched his face go pale as he followed the progression from normal footprints to something else entirely. "What are we looking at here, Nathan?" Before I could answer, we heard the voices again. But this time they were coming from a different direction, from the passage to our left instead of straight ahead where the tracks led. "Help us." It was the female voice, high and frightened. "Please, we're trapped." Jenkins started toward the sound immediately, but I grabbed his arm. "Wait," I said. "Those tracks don't go that way." So, they could have doubled back, gotten turned around in the passages. "Help!" The voice came again, even more desperate. "The ceiling's collapsing. We need help." Every instinct I had as a search and rescue specialist was screaming at me to go help them. But something else, some deeper, older instinct, was telling me to run. "Please, Brad's hurt. He's bleeding." Jenkins pulled free from my grip. "I can't listen to this, Nathan. Even if something weird is going on, there are still people in trouble." He headed toward the voice, and I had no choice but to follow. The passage was narrow, forcing us to move single file with Jenkins in the lead. Our flashlight beams danced across limestone walls that seemed to press closer together the further we went. After about 50 feet, the passage opened into another chamber. This one was smaller than the first, with a ceiling low enough that we had to duck in places. And it was empty. "Hello?" Jenkins called out. "Where are you?" No answer. We searched the chamber thoroughly, checking every crack and crevice that might hide a person. Nothing. No signs that anyone had ever been there. "They must be further back," Jenkins said, but his voice had lost some of its confidence. That's when the temperature started dropping. It happened fast. Within seconds, our breath was coming out in visible puffs. The warm air that had been flowing out of the caves was gone, replaced by a cold that seemed to seep right through our clothes and into our bones. And then we heard something that made us both freeze. Humming. Someone was humming a tune I didn't recognize, a slow, sad melody that echoed through the passages around us. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, like the cave walls themselves were singing. "That's not human," Jenkins whispered. The humming stopped. In the silence that followed, we heard footsteps. Not the heavy, dragging steps we'd heard in Serpent's Mouth, but light, quick footsteps like a child running. They seemed to circle around us, coming from one passage, then another, then fading away, only to start up again from a completely different direction. "We're getting out of here," I said. "Now." We turned back toward the entrance passage, but our flashlight beams revealed something that made my heart stop. The passage was blocked, not by a cave-in or fallen rocks. It was blocked by a wall of what looked like limestone, but limestone that was smooth and wet, like it had just formed. And in the surface of that fresh rock, I could see shapes pressed into it like fossils, human shapes. 3 figures embedded in the limestone like insects trapped in amber. I could make out faces, hands pressed against the rock from the inside, mouths open in silent screams. "That's impossible," Jenkins breathed. But even as he said it, I could see the rock was still moving, still forming, and I could hear sounds from inside it, muffled voices, scratching, tapping, like the people trapped in there were still alive, still trying to get out. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees, and our flashlights started to flicker. In the unstable light, the faces in the rock seemed to move, to turn toward us with eyes that reflected our beams like mirrors. "The other passage," I said. "We'll have to go the long way around." But when we turned toward the only remaining exit from the chamber, something was standing there waiting for us. It looked like one of the geology students at first, a young man in hiking boots and a flannel shirt. But his face was wrong. His features kept shifting, like clay being molded by invisible hands. His eyes were holes filled with golden light, and when he smiled, I could see rows of teeth that belonged in a snake's mouth, not a human's. "Looking for something?" he asked, and his voice was like the rumbling we'd heard earlier, like the sound of rocks grinding together deep underground. Jenkins raised his flashlight like a weapon, but the beam passed right through the figure like it was made of smoke. "What do you want?" I managed to ask. The thing that wore a student's face tilted its head to one side, studying us with those burning eyes. "Want?" it repeated, and now its voice sounded like the scared girl we'd heard calling for help. "I want you to understand. You've been walking on sacred ground. You've been disturbing things that should stay buried." The chamber around us started to change. The walls began to flow like water, revealing carved symbols and pictographs that definitely hadn't been there before. The same serpent from Serpent's Mouth, but now the paintings seemed to move in our flickering light, the great horned head turning to look at us directly. "Leave," the thing said, and now it sounded like my grandmother's voice, like she was sitting on her porch telling me stories about Kitawa. "Leave now, and don't come back. This is your only warning." Our flashlights died completely, plunging us into absolute darkness. In that blackness, I heard Jenkins breathing beside me, fast and shallow like he was hyperventilating. I reached out and found his arm, solid and real, in a world that had stopped making sense. Then the lights came back on. We were standing at the entrance to Devil's Throat, outside in the daylight. Our gear was scattered around us like we'd dropped it and run. The dogs were barking again, but they sounded different, scared and angry at the same time. Jenkins and I looked at each other, both of us pale and shaking. "How did we?" he started. "I don't know." We checked our watches. According to the time, we'd been in the cave for less than 5 minutes. But it had felt like hours. "The people trapped in the rock," Jenkins said. "Were they real?" I thought about the faces we'd seen, the sounds of scratching and tapping from inside the limestone. Then I remembered the backpack we'd found outside Devil's Throat. I looked around for it, but it was gone. No sign it had ever been there. But the footprints were still visible in the soft earth around the cave entrance. Only now they led away from the cave instead of into it, like whoever had made them had walked backwards out of the cave, their feet never quite touching the ground. We didn't talk much on the hike back to the trucks. What was there to say? That we'd just experienced something that couldn't be explained by any rational means? That the mountain itself seemed to be alive and aware and very, very angry? By the time we reached the vehicles, the fog was rolling in thick from the valley below. Within minutes, visibility dropped to maybe 20 feet. The temperature was falling fast too. What had started as a chilly October day was turning into something that felt more like winter. "We need to get down to town," Jenkins said, loading his gear into the truck. "Call for backup. Maybe get the state police involved." I was about to agree when I heard the voices again. This time they were coming from the direction of the original campsite, and they sounded terrified. "Help! Somebody help us!" It's got Dave. Oh God, it's got Dave. Please, anyone, we're at the camp. Jenkins and I looked at each other. We both knew those voices weren't real, couldn't be real, but they sounded so genuine, so desperate, that every instinct we had was screaming at us to respond. It's trying to get us back up there, I said. Yeah. Jenkins checked his rifle, making sure it was loaded. Question is, do we let it? Another scream echoed through the fog, high and terrified. Then, silence. I thought about those geology students, about the faces we'd seen pressed into the limestone. Real or not, people were missing. 4 kids who'd come up here to study rocks and hadn't gone home to their families. We go back? I said. But we do it smart, and if things get weird again, we run. The hike back to the campsite took twice as long in the fog. We had to use our flashlights even though it was still afternoon, and every 50 feet we'd stop and listen, trying to make sure we weren't walking into a trap. When we finally reached the clearing, everything looked different. The tents were still there, but they were arranged differently. Not in the neat line we'd seen before, but in a circle around what looked like a fire pit. Only, instead of ashes and burned wood, the pit was filled with stones arranged in complex patterns, and the equipment circles we'd found earlier were gone. Instead, there were symbols carved into the earth itself, deep gouges that formed the same serpent pictographs we'd seen in the caves. This wasn't here before, Jenkins whispered. I knelt down and touched one of the carved symbols. The earth around it was warm, and when I pulled my hand back, my fingers were stained, with something that looked like sulfur mixed with clay. That's when we saw the light. It was coming from Serpent's mouth. A golden glow that pulsed like a heartbeat. Not electric light or firelight, but something else entirely. Something that made the fog around the cave entrance swirl and dance like it was alive. We should leave, Jenkins said. Call in the cavalry and come back with a full team. But even as he said it, we both knew it wouldn't matter. Whatever was happening on Devil's Backbone wasn't going to wait for reinforcements. It was happening now. And if we left, we might never get another chance to find those missing students. 5 minutes, I said. We go in, we look around, and we get out. 5 minutes. We approached Serpent's mouth with our weapons ready and our flashlights off. The glow from inside was bright enough to see by. As we got closer, I could feel heat radiating from the cave entrance, like standing near a bonfire. The sulfur smell was stronger than ever, but underneath it was something else. Something organic and alive, like the musk of a large animal. We reached the cave mouth and peered inside. The main chamber had changed completely. Where before there had been sandy floor and limestone walls, now there were carved steps leading down into a vast space that definitely hadn't existed before. The walls were covered in pictographs that seemed to move in the golden light, and the ceiling had opened up to reveal a dome that stretched up into darkness. And at the center of it all, coiled around a raised platform of carved stone, was Kitoa. It was exactly like my grandmother had described, and nothing like I'd ever imagined. 40 feet of serpentine body covered in scales that looked like black glass, reflecting the golden light in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The head was massive, bull-like, with curved horns that gleamed like polished bone and eyes that burned with their own inner fire. And arranged around the platform, kneeling in positions of worship or terror, were the 4 geology students. They were alive, but changed. Their skin had the same grayish color we'd seen on the girl in the cave, and their eyes reflected the golden light like mirrors. They moved in perfect unison, swaying back and forth in time with the creature's breathing. Jesus Christ, Jenkins breathed. The great serpent's head turned toward us, and I felt the weight of its attention like a physical force. When it spoke, its voice came from everywhere at once. The walls, the floor, the air itself. You have returned, it said, and its voice was like the sound of continents shifting. Despite my warning, I tried to speak, but my throat had gone completely dry. Jenkins raised his rifle, but his hands were shaking so badly he couldn't aim. They disturbed the deep places. Kitoa continued, gesturing toward the students with one massive coil. They broke seals that have held for centuries. They woke me from the earth's embrace. The creature's eyes fixed on mine, and suddenly I could see everything. The history of this place, the Cherokee ceremonies that had once been held here, the careful rituals that had kept the ancient guardian sleeping deep in the mountain's heart. and the slow erosion of those protections as white settlers moved in, as the old ways were forgotten, as people stopped believing in the things that lived beneath the world. Your people have short memories, the serpent said. You build on sacred ground and wonder why the earth shakes. You drill into the mountain's bones and act surprised when something fights back. What do you want? I managed to ask. I want to sleep, Kitawa replied. I want to return to the deep places and dream until the next age. But first, there must be guardians. There must be those who remember, who keep the warnings alive. The 4 students stood up in perfect unison and turned to face us. Their faces were serene, peaceful, but their eyes were empty of everything that had made them human. They will stay, the creature said. They will become part of the mountain, part of the stone itself. And you will carry the warning back to your people. You will tell them that some places are not meant for the living. The chamber began to shake, and I could feel the mountain itself moving around us. Rocks started falling from the ceiling, and the golden light began to fade. Choose, Kitawa said, its voice now barely a whisper. Stay and join them in eternal watch, or go and spread the word. But choose quickly. The door closes soon. Jenkins grabbed my arm. Nathan, we have to go. But I was thinking about my grandmother, about the stories she'd told me on summer evenings, about respect for the old places, the sacred places, the things that were older and wiser than human understanding. I reached into my pocket and pulled out something I'd carried for 18 years. A small pouch of tobacco my grandmother had given me before she died. For the spirits, she'd said, in case you ever need to make peace. I opened the pouch and scattered the tobacco on the chamber floor. We understand, I said, speaking to the great serpent in words my grandmother had taught me long ago. Cherokee words that meant respect, acknowledgement, and promise. Kitawa's burning eyes softened slightly. Go, it said. Remember, and keep others away. The chamber collapsed around us as we ran, Jenkins pulling me along when my legs nearly gave out. We burst out of Serpent's Mouth just as the entrance sealed itself behind us, tons of limestone flowing together like water until there was nothing but solid rock. The fog lifted suddenly, and we could see the entire ridgeline. Every cave entrance had been sealed. Devil's Backbone looked exactly like it had for thousands of years, before humans had ever set foot on it. Except for the silence. The unnatural quiet that had started this whole thing was gone, replaced by the normal sounds of mountain life. Birds calling, wind through the trees, the distant sound of water flowing somewhere down in the valley. And carved into the limestone where Serpent's Mouth had been, barely visible unless you knew what to look for, was a single word in Cherokee. The official report was simple enough. Seismic activity had caused several cave-ins along Devil's Backbone Ridge, trapping 4 geology students inside. The caves were deemed too unstable for rescue operations, and the area was permanently closed to the public. The families weren't happy, but there wasn't much they could do. Sometimes the mountains take people, and sometimes they don't give them back. Jenkins requested a transfer 2 weeks later. Said he wanted to work somewhere flatter, somewhere with fewer caves. I didn't blame him. We never talked about what we'd seen, but I could tell it was eating at him the same way it was eating at me. I stayed on Devil's Backbone for another 5 years before retiring. Kept hikers and climbers away from the sealed cave entrances, told them about unstable rock and dangerous gases. Most listened. A few didn't, but they always seemed to change their minds once they got close to the ridgeline. Something about the place just felt wrong to them, and they'd turn back without really understanding why. The Cherokee tribe sent a delegation up to the ridge 6 months after the incident. They performed some kind of ceremony, burning sage and tobacco, speaking in the old language. They thanked me for respecting the old ways and asked me to keep watching the mountain. The guardian sleeps now, the tribal elder told me. But it dreams, and if it's disturbed again. He didn't need to finish. I understood. I've been retired for 15 years now, but I still drive up to Devil's Backbone once a month. Just to check. The sealed cave entrances remain sealed, and the ridgeline stays quiet. But sometimes, on foggy days when the light hits the limestone just right, I can see shadows moving behind the rock, patient shadows, waiting. The land developers have been sniffing around lately, talking about building a resort up there. Prime mountain views, they say. Perfect for a ski lodge or luxury cabins. They've offered the Forest Service a lot of money And budget cuts being what they are, I'm worried someone might be tempted. That's why I'm telling this story now. Because my grandmother was right, some places aren't meant for the living. Some things are older and more powerful than human ambition, and they demand respect. The Cherokee have a saying, "The mountain remembers everything and forgets nothing." Devil's Backbone remembers 4 young people who thought they could study sacred places like any other rocks. It remembers a time when people knew enough to stay away from the deep places, the old places, the spots where the earth itself was alive and watching. And it remembers a promise made by 2 park rangers on a foggy October afternoon, that the warning would be kept, that the stories would be told, that the guardian's sleep would not be disturbed again. I've kept that promise for 20 years. Now I'm passing it on to you. Stay away from Devil's Backbone Ridge. Don't let them build on it. Don't let them drill into it. Don't let them forget that some mountains are more than just rock and dirt. Because Kiowa is still down there, coiled in chambers deeper than any human has mapped. Still dreaming, still waiting, still watching 4 young guardians who learned too late that there are worse things than death. And if you don't believe me, if you think this is just another campfire story meant to scare tourists, then drive up to Devil's Backbone on a foggy night. Stand where Serpent's Mouth used to be and put your ear to the limestone. Listen carefully. You might hear them, tapping, still trying to get out.